Things got it going now. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our last Stormwater, Ohio Stormwater Roundtable of the year. Hope you used this resource and will continue to in the future. We'll have these again, like I said, probably next year. And also bring you some content that you find worthwhile, like this today. I'm very excited. We've got Rachel Seacrest here from OEPA, which is 401 permitting supervisor for the 401 permits. That's something that's very interesting to us on a whole level, especially with changes that have occurred recently with the laws of the US, that kind of thing. So understanding how that works, we get a lot of questions about wetlands and streams and impacts and things like that. And I hope we can address some of that, and feel free to ask questions because you've got the people here. We've also got
Andrew Wynn.
Andrew Wynn. He is with the, help me again, the
North branch of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Huntington
District Corps. So again, we've got regulatory experts here looking for questions. You can ask them about things that you have in mind. I certainly have some. We look forward to letting you tell us what's going on, and I will read it to you now. So,
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so I appreciate everyone coming today to learn about 401 and 404 regulations. I'm going to speak about 401 isolated wetland regulations, what we do and don't regulate. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is joining virtually, Andrew Wynn, as I said. And so he'll be discussing 404. There are two partner permits, state and federal, so that's why you're here from both of us. And in the future, if anyone ever has questions that come your way, or if you have questions on what's permitted or should I have a permit, my card's over here. And we always encourage phone calls, emails, messages. We want to make sure we address issues up front rather than on the back end. So just to begin, hi. So my name is Rachel Seacrest, and I am the 401 and isolated wetland permitting supervisor at the Ohio EPA in our division of surface water. I've been with the agency for about 14 and a half years. I've been in the 401 program the entire time, so I've been around a little while. Before that, I did some environmental consulting, so I actually went out and did wetland and stream delineations and assessments, and then prepared applications to submittal to the Ohio EPA. So I've been doing this sort of work for about 18 years, both in private sector and in the government. So I have a little experience, I have some knowledge. So again, if there's ever questions, always feel free to reach out to me or any of my staff. I supervise staff around the state. There's 6 permitting staff. So Ohio EPA's 401 section is really now in 3 groups. We have permitting, and I supervise the permitting staff around the state. We have a section that does what's called mitigation compliance. So they review streams and wetlands that have been constructed for what's mitigation, and I'll go through what that is. And then we have a wetland ecology group that is wetland research. And then we have a group that investigates complaints. We've been getting lots and lots of complaints over the last few years, more than ever before, which we appreciate, right? Need to determine if what's done is compliant or not. So we have 3 different sections. I supervise permitting. All right. Okay, so again, today I'm going to discuss what we regulate under federal regulations. So under section 401 of the Clean Water Act, that's the section of the Clean Water Act that requires that states, every state in the country, so states are responsible for administering and regulating streams, wetlands, waters of the U.S. under section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And what we regulate is the placement of fill material into waters. There's other sorts of regulations that pertain to water, stormwater. Some of you may be familiar with stormwater regulations. There's NPDES discharges, which is point source into pipe discharges. That's a whole different program. I know enough to be dangerous about that. I can direct you to people that know more than me, but I know a lot about 401, so that's what I'm going to speak about. So in Ohio, of course, Ohio EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which differs from US EPA, for the state agency. They have the same name, we do different things. We're the state Ohio EPA. In our specific sections of revised code and administrative code, we have specific sections that specifically outline what we can and cannot regulate, right? That's, some of you work for state government or government agencies, so we can only regulate what's outlined in state law. We get lots of calls and a whole host of things. I've had complaints about moths being on the wrong side of the tree. I've had all kinds of complaints over the years, but we can only enforce regulations or investigate things on what we regulate. So it's very specific. All right, and we also administer what's called impacts to non-jurisdictional or isolated wetlands, which I'll go into greater detail as we proceed here. Oh, and I wanted to tell everyone, this is somewhat informal, right? So if you have questions or anything during the presentation, raise your hand, just shout them out, just ask the question when we have whatever is on the screen, we're in the discussion, ask away, don't take them to the end. That's really what I encourage you to do with this.
Hey,
All
Rachel.
right. Yes.
Hey, can you hear me? This is Andrew Went with the Corps of Engineers. I'm actually in the lobby of the Zoom meeting. I haven't been let in yet, so I called in. I don't know if someone can let me in.
Yeah, Brooke with Stormwater, is,
Dave's on the.
and Dave, okay,
Yeah.
they are looking into this, Andrew. So you can hear
Okay.
me, but.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'm just letting you know, like I'm in the Zoom meeting, like just so I am here, but I've also called in so I can hear everybody as well. So I am here.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Yep.
Yes,
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
you're the 304 number, right, Andrew?
That is the number I've called in from. Yes, but in the lobby for the Zoom meeting, it should have my name up there.
Okay, it says in the lobby, you should see his name.
Yeah.
They're looking at the computer, they're figuring it out.
Okay. No worries.
While they're doing that, I'm just gonna continue. Andrew, you can hear me, you know this stuff backward and forward. So they're working on getting you in, okay?
Okay. No worries.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. All right, so what do we regulate under the Clean Water Act? At Ohio EPA, what we regulate is the placement of fill in the waters of the US. And so that's a pretty broad definition that generally is 3 different types of water bodies. Streams and rivers, wetlands, and we'll go into what is a wetland and what we regulate on streams. And then usually lakes and ponds, right? So generally that's what we get, but the definition of waters of the US and waters of the state is pretty broad, and I'll show that to you as well. But this is generally the 3 categories that we deal with. All right, so here is the definition in the Ohio Revised Code of what is a wetland. Now I'll give you a minute to look through this, and then I'm going to point out what to me are some key points here. So this, of course, is, let's start at the beginning. What is a wetland? So a wetland has to meet 3 criteria in accordance with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers manual. So they wrote the book on how to figure out what is a wetland, but generally it has to have hydric soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and hydrology, right? It has to meet those 3 parameters in accordance with the Corps' manual. And we even reference their manual in our rules because they are the authorities on what is a wetland, all right? So that's the agency that will work with you to ensure that what you've delineated is in fact a wetland or not. All right, so and sometimes it's not as easy as one might think, right? Like the layman on the street might see some cattails. That's a pretty easy call potentially to say, okay, that's wetland or not. But then we have some areas it's not as easy to visually see if an area is or is not a wetland. So here's an example of an area, and just looking at this, who would say this is a wetland? Right, it doesn't. Looks like a sort of grassy field with a couple of woody logs, right? Now, this is the wetland, this is this area, let's say in October, August, okay? Let's look at that same area in March or April. This is it. All right, this is the same area. This is Tom Hart-Cherry. He was the first 401 supervisor at the Ohio EPA. And this wetland is type, it's a vernal pool type wetland, right? So they can be very dry in their drier seasons, but in the spring and early summer, they may have quite a bit of water as a result of groundwater table fluctuations and such. And they are really home to a lot of really cool plant and animal species, some that can be endangered. So this is a really rare, sort of very, to me, it's sort of a special type of wetland that's we're getting less and less of them in the state, right, with development and such. This is a vernal pool wetland, and so my point here is, it's not as easy as you might think to look at an area to determine if an area is a wetland. A wetland delineation would have to be done to make that determination. And that's always my answer when folks call me. They're like, well, I looked over the map online, because there's some tools you can look at online, like in National Wetland Inventory or NWI. And so folks tell me all the time that, hey, I've looked at NWI, no wetlands, good to go, right? But my answer back is always, that is a tool that's based on, and Andrew might know more about this than me, but like aerial imagery and thermal mapping and other sort of, I guess there's hydric soil layers, so it pulls all this sort of desktop review, but it's not a definitive answer. If an area is a wetland, you have to field verify or do ground truthing, right, to determine if the area is a wetland. So that's my response to that. I get that question all the time. Yes.
So with the wetland, we just had development come along a couple of years ago that there was just areas, it was a farmer's field before, and they farmed it, and then they went to develop it. And they had to get a special permit because there was just like little circles in the middle of this farm field that had been dedicated as wetland until they got the permit to, move the wetland or whatever. How can a former farmer field have just wetland areas like that in that? I mean, what makes that?
Sure, that's an excellent question, and I get these sort of questions also quite often, right? Like, this area now has, perhaps there's been delineation done, it has the soils, it has the plants, it has hydrology, now it meets the criteria in the manual to tell you it is a wetland, but it was never wetland before, maybe it was a farm field, the farmer started farming, and now it's a wetland. Or you have a road put in place, or a railroad track, and now it's a wetland. Okay, but what we regulate, what the Corps regulates is what's on the ground today. So wetlands move, right? They shrink, they grow larger. Once they develop where perhaps there's been something that's dammed up water, now there's more hydrophytic type, or hydrology that have allowed the soils to turn hydric and hydrophytic plants take place. Or perhaps a farmer starts farming and now is no longer actively farming an area. And that's allowing plants to come in perhaps to an area that already has probably hydric soils, maybe hydrology. But you stop farming, so now you have the plants coming in. So what we regulate is what's on the ground today. So if it meets wetland criteria for whatever reason, whatever modifications have been made, if it's wetland today, it's regulated. Okay. There's a few exemptions built into the Clean Water Act. One is actively farmed fields. So if a farmer wants to continue farming and is actively farmed, that may be exempt under the Clean Water Act and not require permitting. The Corps may speak more on that. It's in the CFR, the Code of Federal Register, the federal law that outlines what is exempt. And one thing that is exempt is active farming. But yeah, that's a good question. I get that a lot.
Rachel, I know something we look at is a change in land use. So when it goes from agricultural to residential, that land use change needs to be reevaluated. What kind of conditions they have in these farm fields.
Right.
We get a lot of farm wetlands here.
Right, yes. And then if it's no longer farmed, and then perhaps the wetland pops up, and now they want to build a residential development. Yeah, we're getting a lot of that, especially in the Licking County area and other areas, right? We're getting a lot of that. If it's wetland today, and they're proposing to build a housing development, even if it was a farm wetland, now you're changing the land use, is no longer actively farmed, you're building. So yes, that would require permitting. Yep. All right. So to determine if an area is a wetland, you follow the Corps' manual. The Corps will verify if it does or does not meet what is or is not a wetland. So that's the Corps, okay? They will also tell you if it's what's called isolated versus jurisdictional, which I'll get to in a bit also, right? So if it drains into other wetlands or if it's sort of an isolated spot on the landscape. What Ohio EPA does as the state agency protective of, our charge is to be protective of water quality, right? So the first step in that is determining what is the quality of the wetland. And we as an agency we have a wetland ecology research group, and they've developed a few different assessment methods to determine wetland quality. And I'll go through those in a bit, but there's 3 different categories of wetland in the state. These tools will lead into these. Category 1 wetlands are very low quality wetlands. These are ones that perhaps have a lot of human disturbance, right? Maybe it was actively farmed and now you have some invasive species popping up, but they are hydrophytic invasive species. Perhaps there's no buffers now, there's things built all the way around it. Perhaps there's discharges from a coal mine or next to a road. But it'll be low quality, low species diversity, which is perhaps 1 or 2 different species, perhaps low quality species, invasive species. There won't be threatened or endangered species. So it's a low quality wetland. Those are our category 1 wetlands. And then we have category 2 wetlands. And these are wetlands that are, they're pretty good. They're fair to moderate quality. This is most of the wetlands in the state are category 2. We have, good moderate, we have good species diversity, right? You have more than 1 or 2 different species in these sort of wetlands. They're usually dominated by natives, but they may have, but invasive species may appear in certain areas of those as well. So those are category 2 wetlands. And then we have the best of the best, or the category 3 wetlands. And these are the ones to me that are really fun to go out and look at. These are really nice wetlands. So they're in excellent condition. They usually have no human disturbance. They have wide buffers protecting them. And they're dominated by sensitive or high quality different species. Invasive species are rare, absent. There may also be threatened or endangered species within those wetland areas. And so the agency will come out to sites, the Corps will go out as well, they'll determine if it is or is not a wetland. Ohio EPA will come out and verify the wetland categorization. So that's what my staff do. They go out and they do these site visits to verify the wetland quality. That's part of the permitting process. The first step is determining the quality. All right, so the tools that the agency has developed, our wetland ecology group with a grant from US EPA, we developed a few different tools to tell us the quality of that wetland. One that's most often used is called the ORAM, or the Ohio Rapid Assessment Method. And this is a tool that's been around since the early 2000s. And it's really a 10-page form, but the meat and potatoes of it goes to what's called the narrative 2-page form. And it goes through 6 different metrics that looks at the wetland size, the buffer size, surrounding land use type, what sort of vegetation is within it, what sort of disturbances may have occurred, the substrate, hydrology, and the habitat as a whole, if there's any threatened or endangered species, and then it looks at the quality of the vegetation and if there's what's called microtopography. So is it an amphibian breeding pool? Is there hummocks and tussocks? Is there mature forested area? So it goes through all this and is assigned a numeric score, right? 0 to 100. And it goes generally 0 to 30 cat 1, 30 to 60 cat 2, 60 above cat 3. There's some gray zones and other caveats, but that's generally what it is. So that's the ORAM. That's the one that we see in 98% of our applications that come into us. Because it's usually you just walk the entire wetland, you categorize it using this tool. So it's a physical habitat characteristic. It's called level 2 tool. There's a couple other tools. So if you land in one of those what I call gray zones between the wetland categorizations, you have the option of either doing a level 3 assessment, which is either the VIPI or the amphibi-IPI, or you can accept the higher of the 2 quality categorizations. So the level 3 tools are the ones that are much more time intensive, and they take folks that are really experts in determining plant ID or the amphibian ID. So VIPI is Vegetative Index of Biotic Integrity, and then plant surveys. You go out and you lay plots, you have to identify the plant species, you have to do what's called clippings, you weigh that, you have to do a really complicated analysis using an automated macro-enabled spreadsheet that we developed, and it also gives you a number of the quality of the wetland. But it's a much more intensive tool, but it really to me tells us more, it's a more true tool. It tells us the wetland quality. So that's called the VIPI, and that's what we actually require in wetland mitigation sites. So if someone's built a wetland, they have to do the VIPI to tell us the quality. The ORAM is not an appropriate tool for wetland mitigation. Yes.
That's you answered my
Oh,
question.
okay, I was gonna-
When you would use that
Awesome.
tool.
You're thinking ahead of me.
Thank you.
Yep, VIPI is used for either gray zone or wetland mitigation.
Okay.
And the amphibi-IPI, I've only, in 15 years, I've seen that used 2 or 3 times, maybe perhaps. It's a really interesting tool. You use those called funnel traps in areas that have amphibian breeding pools. They collect salamanders and other sorts of amphibians, and then you identify those species, and it also pops out a numeric score. So it's a very specialized tool for a very specialized type of wetland. We will accept it, but I just very rarely see it used. So those are the tools we have as an agency developed to determine quality. All right, so we talked about what is a wetland or not, who does that, what is the quality, who does that, and how it's defined. Now let's talk about streams. So you think it might be easy to say, okay, well, if you have or have not, please fill in a stream. But where's that line? What do we regulate below and what do we not regulate? That's sometimes not as easy a question to answer, right? So on this picture on this slideshow, and is Andrew in? Can you see this now? Do we know? Andrew, can you see the?
Call in.
Okay. So if you can't see it.
Is he in he should be in.
Okay, I just wonder if you can see this, because this is also a core thing. But what we regulate is what's below what's called the ordinary high water mark of a stream. So that yellow line on this picture, and the core is a whole manual on how to determine this. But what we regulate is everything below the ordinary high water mark. So it's not just at the water level, right? It's everything on the bank, because that affects the stream as well, right? So we regulate the entire stream channel that's below the ordinary high water mark. And the stream also has to have what's called a defined bed and bank. And the Corps has some really good guidance documents on how to make that determination. But here's just a quick schematic showing you that we regulate everything below that yellow line. So sometimes we get folks that, they do what's called stream bank stabilization, so they put some riprap or, concrete slabs or, whatever they choose, if it's appropriate, to stabilize the bank. That requires permitting also, right? There's reasons for that, but a lot of folks don't think they need to come to us if it's not in the water, right? It's up here, but we still regulate that. That's an important distinction to make, that folks, make sure folks understand, okay? Okay, all right, so of course, the Corps has the guidance documents and will define what is a stream on your property. If it's, what's called now relatively permanent or non-relatively permanent, so it doesn't fall under the regulations. And I'll get to that more in a bit, because there's court cases that have really changed what we regulate federally in the last couple of years. But again, the Ohio EPA has to be, our charge is to be ensuring no degradation of water quality, right? So the first step is, what is the stream's quality? So we as an agency have some really well-defined tools to determine stream quality for larger streams, especially, right? So we as an agency go out and do water quality surveys in 4 to 5 watersheds throughout this summer, early fall, to determine stream quality. And we have crews that go out and they look at the fish, they look at the macroinvertebrates, and they also do what's called water chemistry sampling. And they determine if a stream falls into one of these is called aquatic life uses, right? So there are aquatic life uses. And you can tell which, if it meets that based on the fish and the bug scores. And then we use the water chemistry, let's say a stream is degraded. We use the water chemistry then to try to tease out what potentially is impacting that stream and why it's degraded. But these are, and I actually interned for the Ohio EPA quite some time ago. And that was my favorite job at Ohio EPA. If paid what I make now, I would still do it if they let me. But I got paid to go electron fishing all summer long, and it was really fun. It was my first job with Ohio EPA. But anyways, so we use that data to determine stream quality. And I'll go through these as well here. And these fit larger streams really well. Some of the smaller streams, which is what we normally see in 401 land, we use a different tool, which I'll go through as well. Oh, I'm going through the now. Okay, so streams that have been sampled by the agency are then that use, that aquatic life uses, that we put in our state law, in the Ohio Administrative Code, under what's called our water quality standards. We define what the stream's use is in our standards. So those streams are called designated. They're designated in our water quality standards. Most streams that are proposed for impact under 401 water quality certifications, which is our permit, they're very, very small. So we as an agency don't have the staff time to go out there's thousands of miles with smaller headwater streams in the state. We've not been out to all these to determine the appropriate aquatic life use. So they're what's called undesignated, right? They're not listed in our standards. So let's say we have an application in on that, but it's not in our water quality standards. We still need to know that stream's quality to move forward on an application. So we allow folks to do some assessment methods to tell us stream quality. The one that we usually get is what's called the QHEI, or the Qualitative Habitat Evaluation Index. It is a 2-page form that you use to characterize the stream's physical habitat, similar to OGRA. Okay, so we accept QHEI, but it generally is a tool that we accept for larger streams. For smaller streams, we have asked folks to do the HHEI, which is the Headwater Habitat Evaluation Index. And it's also a 2-page form, somewhat similar, to tell us the quality of the smaller streams. It doesn't put you in an aquatic life use, but it does tell you quality, because it's a tool for us as an agency. And those biological assessment methods I discussed earlier, fish and bugs. The IBI is for the fish, index biotic integrity. The ICI is a tool for the bugs, macroinvertebrates. And those are the tools that are, you collect the data for the fish and the bugs, and then you put it into this database, or this, it used to be a spreadsheet, but now it's a database, and it pops out a numeric score, like the IBI or ICI scoring.
Question.
Yes.
So when an application is submitted
Mhm.
with these undesignated streams,
Mhm.
then who is the one determining this, and what level of qualifications do they have to make that assessment?
Yep, it's good questions. So we, environmental consultants are the ones that are preparing this and submitting to the agency. We at this time do not require that they have any sort of official certification or level of expertise in order to do these, to submit them to us. We tried, a few years ago to go through what was called the Water Quality Certified Professional Program, to develop a program to do that, but it sort of fizzled out. It was removed from state law. So now whenever we as an agency receive these, my staff do have to go out to verify it was done correctly in order for us to know if it is appropriate to move forward with our application on. Does that answer that?
So you're verifying.
Our step by
the
step.
Quality of the data.
Yes, Ohio EPA is, yes.
Okay.
Yep,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we're very dictated by rule and law, right? A lot of folks, I get all kinds of calls from folks, and they just think the agency can regulate all kinds of things, or we just do anything we can to protect the environment. And while I think some things might be a good idea, that's not what we do. We're very, very regulated by the rules and laws, and that's what we can regulate. So the Clean Water Act is a federal law that outlines what we can do, what is regulated under section 401. And then the state law is the Ohio Revised Code, and the Ohio Administrative Code gives us more detail on what was specified in the ORC. These are our sections of law and rule that tell us our job at the Ohio EPA. Okay, so just a quick history on the Clean Water Act, is also known as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972. Its goal, it's very broad, I like it, it's lofty. How do you do it though, right? The goal is to maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. It sounds good, right? Then the states have to determine how to protect our water quality to meet that goal. So I think we've done a pretty good job in Ohio. We have some really good tools. I know other states really look to us for our ORAM. I think it's pretty widely respected. The assessment tools for the streams also, ICI, I think are pretty highly respected. We get a lot of questions from other states on our tools. So I think we're doing pretty good in Ohio. We're moving forward on changes, as always, with rules and laws on the federal level that dictate what we can do on state level. The Corps regulates the same sort of projects under section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So if you want to place fill in a stream or wetland or lake or water of the US, you need a federal permit and a state permit, a 404 and a 401. The 401 certifies the 404, and so the 404 is not valid until you have 401. Okay, so Ohio EPA regulates it under 401, and then the Corps has what's called the 404B1 guidelines they have to go through. So they look at different aspects of the project, but you need both. They're part of purpose. My point here. And I want to make this really clear because sometimes folks get a permit from us and they think they're good to go, but that's not the case. Or sometimes I've had folks tell me they got a permit to place fill from the county, and they think they're good. And that's not the case either. So I want to make this very clear. Any placement of fill requires permitting from state and federal level into water in the US. You can't have a county permit. You can't just get, 401 from us, but not the 404 partner permits. Okay, so as I mentioned, Corps 404, and what they do under that is they come out and they review the site and they will determine if it's jurisdictional or not. So is it a water of the US? And so they will then at that point, after their site visit, they'll go back and they have an analysis they run through, and I'm sure Andrew will speak to this. And then they issue what's called a jurisdictional determination. So they determine if it is or not jurisdictional. So they'll issue it looks like a letter, but it's called a jurisdictional determination, and it will outline what falls under federal regulations. Or it'll say what is non-jurisdictional, and then it falls to the state to regulate those waters. And then the Corps also reviews permit applications under the 21 guidelines. The 21-point review, a little bit about it, nothing dangerous. But then I tell you to go talk to the Corps, they're the ones that do it. And then, as I said, section 401 requires that the state ensure that the proposed action does not violate state water quality standards. So our focus is water quality, like I keep mentioning. Okay, and here's the specific sections of ORC and OAC that pertain to what we do. I can sit here and recite these sections to you all day long. Like I said, the rules are our Bible. It is what we do. It's hammered into our heads. I've been deposed 3 times. The lawyers are very much hammered into your heads. But this is what pertains to what we do. And they're always changing. We update our rules every 5 years, or other people propose changes. So you got to keep up with these. But sometimes I started this job in 2010. And sometimes I still am thinking back to the regulations that were in place then, but they change. You got to keep up with them. You got to keep up with the times. All right. So the anti-DEG rule was in OAC 3745-105, and this is the rule that outlines how we ensure the protection of water quality. So it was developed in 1978, so older than me, say that, but it was updated in 2017, so that's the one we have to look to. And our charge under that section of state law is to maintain and protect the existing use of a stream, of a water body. And so the designated use is one that's outlined in state law. But existing use is that use the stream has today, even if it's not listed in our water quality standards. So there's a very legal distinction between those two, but our charge is to protect the existing uses of streams. and it does allow the director to authorize a lowering of water quality after the consideration of what the items listed there. So that's an important point to do. We as a state agency can allow a lowering of water quality after review of these components in an application. Okay, so our wetland anti-deg rule, really good rule, in my opinion. It's very specific. It really tells my staff, I have had a lot of, I've been a supervisor for 12 years. And newer staff especially appreciate when it's very black and white. Like, here's what we do regulated, here's what we don't. Gray zone is supposed to get you in trouble. Then you get inconsistency that pops up or other sort of aspects that perhaps aren't helpful to my staff doing their job. But the wetland anti-deg rule is very specific. It outlines Cat 1, Cat 2 wetlands, what those are, what we regulate with those, and then it outlines what is mitigation for those, what our preference is, and then what's called the ratio, and I'll go through that. But it's very specific, very much appreciate this wetland anti-deg rule. And we're working on one similar for streams. Now we finally have a stream assessment tool in our Ohio Administrative Code for the first time in a lifetime. And so that's very exciting to us as an agency. But this is a fairly old rule, but it's very, very helpful for us doing what we do at the agency. Mitigation. So anybody who places fill material into the water of the US or state has to do what's called mitigation, compensatory mitigation. And this is where you have to, or someone has to, build, create, enhance, restore, or preserve a stream or a wetland somewhere else to mitigate for the loss of that wetland or stream's function and value to our watersheds, right? So someone can't just fill in a wetland, 12 acres of wetland, and be done. You have to somehow give those values and functions of that back to the people, right? Because without wetlands and streams, as you all probably know, have functions, right? Wetlands filter pollutants, they can hold total suspended solids. They have a whole bunch of really good aspects of the watershed that are of value. And by removing those from the watershed, we lose those values. And this is one reason, like Governor DeWine has had this Ohio initiative, building hundreds of acres of wetlands, especially up in Northwest Ohio, because they do have a very good function to the environment. So that's why mitigation is required. I think the federal law outlines that there be no net loss of wetlands, right? So no wetland, we can't lose wetland, that's acreage in the country. So our preferred options are listed here in the order that we like to see folks propose mitigation. So it's mitigation banks, in lieu fee, and then permitted responsible, also known as individual mitigation. So what a mitigation bank is, and this is where a mitigation banker, is what they're called, he builds a wetland, a large wetland, right? Let's say 100 acres. And then he has to get that approved through what's called the interagency review team, which is the IRT, is made up of state and federal agencies. And they have to approve this and then approve when he's selling credits. It's it's a very regulated process. But anyways, they make a mitigation bank, say it's 100 acres, and then let's say you're impacting 2 acres of wetland on your site, build a housing development. Okay, so the mitigation ratio would be, let's say, 2 to 1 for what you're impacting. So for the 2 acres you're impacting, you have to do 4 acres of mitigation. And so you have to buy 4 credits at this bank. He would sell you 4 acres or 4 credits at his bank, and then you're done. He is then in charge of making sure that that meets all the goals that's required by state and federal government. So that's a mitigation banker. In lieu fee is a sort of different program where you can buy credits from them as well, but they have to build up so much in their pot, and then they build the streams and wetlands after they have so much money to build up. So they also are building streams and wetlands or enhancing or preserving, but they do it after they have so much money in place. Mitigation banks are already built. That's the big difference between the two. Individual mitigation projects. So this used to be at the top of the mitigation hierarchy in our state law when I started with the agency. But as time has gone on and research has been done, and we've learned, right, from the past experiences, a lot of permitting responsible mitigation wasn't meeting goals that were set. Like some weren't even meeting wetland criteria, right? So we struggled to try to bring those folks into compliance. And that's why another reason we've shifted, 1, to be consistent with the federal mitigation hierarchy, which is this. And then 2, we're seeing that mitigation bankers are much more successful at building mitigation because that's what they do, right? That's their job. A lot of these folks that were doing these permitted responsible sites, they were building housing development and trying to slap a wetland over here. And then they had to monitor for 5 to 10 years, and they had certain goals they had to meet, and then they weren't meeting the goals. Then we had to go out, try to work with them to get them to meet the goals. It was like this whole process. So mitigation banking is easier. You just buy the credits and you're done, but there is a cost, of course, associated with that. So it's a business decision, but our preference is banking and loop feed. Okay, and then we have what are called ratios that are provided in our state rule, and I'll go through those in a minute. All right, so what needs a permit? And we discussed this very briefly. You asked me a question in the beginning. What needs a permit? Anybody placing fill material in streams, wetlands, rivers, ponds, lakes, waters of the US. So you're building housing development, you're mining coal, building a road, you're turning a wetland into a farm field. All these, any activity placing fill requires permitting under the Clean Water Act. There's different types of permitting, but it all requires permitting. Mechanized tree clearing is an interesting one that we see a lot. So if you have heavy machinery in a stream or a wetland, I've seen both. Let's say we have a backhoe going down the street with these gravel mining in the stream, or he's trying to straighten the channel, whatever. Heavy machinery, you have case law that shows that has defined heavy machinery moving around substrates and such within streams or wetlands is considered fill and is regulated as such. So you can't just go to like a wooded wetland and use heavy machinery to cut the trees or move to grade. Just grading itself is also considered fill, okay? So this is a point, a lot of folks don't think that having mechanized machinery in wetlands or streams is fill, but it is. It does require permitting. It is regulated under the Clean Water Act. So that's just in a nutshell. There are some exemptions, like I said, active agriculture is an exemption. And a few others, but there's one is, oh yes.
Providing a utility, is that under the exemption?
So when you say providing utility, do you
Like if
mean,
you're installing sewer line, sanitary line, I mean, storm line, is that also?
are you talking about trenching then backfilling? That sort of thing, or boring under?
You are asking me more than.
Oh, okay.
I've seen a situation, and that was the question that I raised, is whether or not this would be something that would require it, and
Okay.
it's told, well, utility is going in here, so it would not.
Okay, so anything placing fill in a stream or wetland requires permitting. So if they're like what they call open cut, where they dig like the trench and then they put in a pipeline, whether it be electrical lines or a water line, and then they're backfilling that is considered fill. That does require permitting. If they're boring under or like horizontal directional drilling or just conventional boring, that if it's under, there's no fill, that's not regulated by 40144. So
Okay.
boring under does not.
Boring is not, okay.
Boring does not, as long as there's no fill placement. Sometimes maybe they're putting like work pads in a wetland or whatever. I'm not an expert on boring, but they have to have work pads, right? Areas set up where they can then do the boring. So that, if that's fill, that requires permitting, but they can move that a lot. So oftentimes we don't see that. I want to make one more point. A lot of type of utility lines will fall under what's called general permits, where like it's issued every 5 years and it has all these terms and conditions that are outlined. And if the project meets those terms and conditions, they're like automatically covered. They don't even need to fill out an application, they're just automatically covered. And so maybe that's what they meant. Maybe the project was automatically covered under the general 404, which is called a nationwide permit, and then our 401 for that nationwide permit. Now, I have links to those I can share with folks as well. So some projects are just automatically covered, don't even need to apply, as long as you meet the terms and conditions and those general permits.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
you're welcome. It's a good question.
Rachel, I would
Yes.
also add that it may be a different permit too, maybe stormwater permit or.
Oh, that's a good point. I'm very focused on 401 because stormwater requires, I can get there. Stormwater requires permitting, and from our group at Ohio EPA for any, ground service over an acre. I think it's different for MS4s.
And some
Also,
utility projects are exempt from stormwater.
What is it? Oh,
Some practices are exempt from stormwater permit.
okay.
But you also have linear projects, so that would be more like your sewer lines, gas lines, water lines. They may still need it in a line.
Stormwater. Oh, yeah.
Water
Right.
control meters, to meet permitting. So we've had gas lines, just recently go through plan review, making sure they got their Army Corps permit because it was waters of the state and a wetland that was jurisdictional. So they had to get Army Corps permits and stuff like that, just to, and they were directional boring, but they were putting those pads on, so they were causing a disturbance.
Okay.
So
Yep.
the Corps has a lot of determinations that
The Corps has,
require to, just because our public utility does not mean they're the same.
the Corps, I think it's around 58 different types of nationwide permits. So if someone's, and I've seen the Corps, and Andrew can speak more to this, I'm never sure exactly which nationwide is appropriate, sometimes they're a pretty good guess, but they may get creative, or they have different nationwides it goes under. So it's always best to start with the Corps, right? Somebody who has a project replacing fill, have them start with the Corps to figure out 404 permitting, because that dictates how the state permits it. The Corps is the lead federal agency.
Okay.
Okay, I'll bump everything to you, Andrew.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
still the best thing to get their determination. So you get Corps' determination is really important forward.
It's the first step.
Okay, thank you.
And then you had a question?
Yeah, about exemptions.
Yep.
I've looked through the list and I noticed it says sidewalks, but it doesn't mention stairs.
What, so that's not who we are. What have you been reading? What exemptions have you been looking at?
The exemptions for what needs to be permitted, maybe I'm mistaken.
We can talk about it. I'm not sure, I don't know if that's found in anything that is under 40441, so maybe stormwater?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, and then, so we get this a lot too, it's 401, 404, it's still, but oftentimes goes permitting for a project, which is the same as stormwater. These be under the same manager, because we have a lot of projects that are, they do permitting the same kind of stormwater in 401.
Okay.
So, but if you can pick afterward, show me where you're reading that, or we can discuss that, because that might not be 40441, might be somewhere. Okay. All right, that's it, okay. So the permitting process, right, we figured out what is or is not a wetland, what is or is not a stream under our regulations, and the quality. Now it's the time you want to build something, time to get a permit. All right, so first you have to determine if will you impact a wetland or a stream. If so, then yep, you need a 404, 401, or an isolated wetland permit if it's not under federal regulation. We do advise that folks hire environmental consultant to perform those stream and wetland delineations. It's what they do, they're trained. And then when the materials come in, we know we're familiar with consulting firms that do this, right? So if I get an application and we're familiar with the firm, we can be fairly confident it was done accurately. We do go out and verify scoring, but it's streamlined the process. They're familiar with the process. As I said earlier, that was a good question from earlier. You're not required to hire a professional. And sometimes we get, like private property owners, they want to stabilize the streaming, right? But they don't have a few $1,000s to shell out to hire an environmental consultant to do some work on their property. So they try to do it themselves, and we help in every way we can. So sometimes you're not required to hire a professional, okay? But sometimes if you have a wetland, it is helpful to have someone familiar with plants and soils to do that wetland delineation. Because wetland delineation, it's a 40-hour training, and if you've never done it before, it can be complicated. So it's helpful to hire someone familiar with wetland delineations. And then, as I said, you send that delineation report to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for jurisdictional determination. That is a requirement in our permitting process. We need that JD to move forward with our permit. So without it, we can't even move forward. That's the first step. This is that to the Corps. All right, so the permitting process. Do I have a pointer on here? Let's see.
It might not show for a while because the TV.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I'll just talk through it. Okay, so your first step, black box. You need that jurisdiction, well, yellow box is first step, I guess. You do that site assessment. You look at, is it or is not wetland? How many streams do you have on site? And then the flow. So is it perennial, streams that flow all the time? The intermittent stream, which only flows in relation to a sea or a spring that may move depending on groundwater levels, so intermittent stream. And then ephemeral streams are streams that only run after stormwater events, right? So you would do your site assessment, a delineation report or a waters investigation report would be prepared. That's your site assessment, and it's submitted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for that jurisdictional determination. That's first step. Then they will tell you if it's jurisdictional or not. So if it's jurisdictional, it's the bottom blue box. And then these are the different permitting paths, okay? Maybe it's a smaller project and your resources on site, streams and wetlands are low quality, low to moderate quality. You could apply for a nationwide permit from the Corps potentially, and then either need the nationwide from the Corps, but it's not covered under a general 401 for that nationwide. So you apply for what's called an individual 401 from the Ohio EPA. So that's that box there. But maybe your project's so minimal in nature that you also can get that nationwide from the Corps, but it's not covered under the 401, but you can get what's called a director's authorization. And that's a more streamlined, quicker permitting process we have. Or let's say your project's larger in footprint, okay, you're impacting 12 acres of wetland, high quality stuff, that sort of thing. You may need an individual 401 from Ohio EPA, and an individual 404 from the Corps. This is for bigger projects. Oh, and I forgot this one. Maybe you're really, really lucky. It's covered under the nationwide from the Corps and the general 401 from Ohio EPA. So I think I was talking to someone about that earlier. There's 3 different paths here under nationwide. or you need individual 404, 404, 401, and 404 from the Corps of Engineers for bigger projects. And then, but let's say you have an isolated wetland on site, then there's one path, isolate wetland permit from the Ohio EPA. Those are different permitting paths that you could go down for impacted waters on your project area.
What's the difference between the individual and the nationwide permit?
Good question. Okay, so nationwide permits, it's called a general permit. All right, so it is pre-issued every 5 years, and I'll email you all a link to that. It's on our website. And it has it's 58 different types of nationwide permits, different types of projects. The ones we see most often are like nationwide permit 29, residential development, nationwide permit 12, which used to be linear, but now it's utility lines. Nationwide permit 13, you see all the time, bank stabilization. So the nationwide are the type of projects. And so that's the 4 nationwide permits. Then we have our general 401, we also pre-issue it every 5 years, and it certifies those different nationwide, but you have to meet the terms and conditions in that permit, right? So we sometimes have a limitation, it doesn't apply to category 3 wetlands, but if you're impacted to cat 1 or cat 2 wetlands, you can go under this general permit. So it's kind of a general permit, usually for smaller projects. Sometimes there's also a limitation of it needs to be 300 feet and out of acreage or less than a half acre of impacted wetlands. So it's for smaller projects impacting lower quality resources. But then let's say that you're impacting more or higher quality stuff in wetlands or streams. In that case, you can't fit under the terms and conditions of the general permits, and that you have to apply to the individual 401 and the application specific to your project. And then so you have to submit to us more materials, like you have to do what's called an anti-day review. We need coordination letters to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, ODNR on threatened or endangered species. We need the application form, we need maps, we need schematics. We need a whole list of things, and then we have to do a public notice, and the notice we have per day. We may have to have a public hearing if you're impacting high quality resources. It's a longer process before you can first, essentially. But then what we do in the end is we write a 401 water an individual 401 water supply certification. It's specific to your project. Conditions are for your project specific. So that's an individual 401 404. Okay. So I'll email this whole group links to all these. I can email you links to the individual or the general 401 and 404s, and then links to the instructions for individual to the Allen everything I just said. So is that your name?
Is the determination for classifying the project within the general 401 or nationwide, is that just an email from the Corps or from the EPA and then put that in the project file? Or
So how it starts is you start the court, you issue them that delineation report, then they'll issue that formal jurisdictional determination, which is like a letter. And I think these in our probably been out by PDF via email, but Andrew can answer that. And it will say you have isolated waters on the site or waters of the US. And then you have to apply to us for a permit, and it's an online system through it's called our e-business center. I think the Corps is electronic now too, but because of that. And then when we actually issue the permit, it used to be paper. I don't think we do that. I think it's all PDF now. PDF, it was sent to via email. Thank you. Question. Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay. Yes.
For all these delineations and, sort of final assessments, is it all public information? Is there total transparency on the whole process?
Answer yes.
Any individual project?
Yes. So when we receive individual 401 application or a level 2 or 3 ISO wetland permit application, we public notice it, and then we have a link, we public notice it in a local newspaper. Then it's also on our website. Anybody, I can see right now, our website. You can click on a hyperlink and it will open up the whole permit application for anyone who wants to look at it, Because what we're doing is we're inviting public comments. Anybody who wants to comment on the project can comment. Or we're state agency, right? So everything has public record. And unless it's deemed confidential, which is very rare, like it's a trade secret or there's legal documents with attorneys and such, those might be trade secret or confidential. But most of our, 99% of our records are public record. So anybody can do a public records request. I mean, a little process for that, or let's say you want to see all of the project records for maybe this building. You want to see all the records for this. So you can do a public records request, request all of our files. So yes, all of our records are public records. Yes.
Yeah, so specifically on workflow or high water mark and things like that, are you gonna touch it all on thresholds or minimum impact and when it comes in?
So I can discuss, I think I have a slide on it, if not,
So, we're at Franklin Soil Water, we get a lot of calls, a lot of times after the fact. Small impact, somebody put in a crossing, someone, you know, put in a bunch of riprap or something like that. And they may be 25-foot sections and things like that.
Okay.
And if they tell us before, we say, make sure you reach out, to cover yourself, but, you know, is there any guidance or minimal impact thresholds that don't require a permit, or if it's 5 feet, they need to be notified?
Okay, so the answer is permitting required for any impact. However, this helps a lot. There is, in the nationwide, it spells out specifically, we have, I think for national permit 13, which is base stabilization 5, I think it's 500 feet off the top of my head. So they are under 500 feet. They meet all the other conditions. They're not putting in, you know, concrete slabs and rebars sticking out, pouring wet concrete in. And so generally base stabilizations under 500 feet meet the terms and conditions of that pre-issued nationwide permit, so they're automatically covered. Okay, and then we have to look at our 401 national permit 13, because we as an agency, as I said several times, focuses water quality. So in higher quality watersheds, so streams that we as an agency have sampled and determined to be exceptional warm water habitat, cold water habitat, or it's like seasonal sunlight habitat, those are ones where we want permit application for every project. So you have to switch between 2 lots, it's a higher quality watershed. You guys look at the 404 and the 401 and see if they do or do not meet all those general conditions. They may, and we've had some where we go out and investigate a complaint, we get hundreds of complaints. And we say, okay, well, we review the site, they're in a stream, it's called stream eligible area, so it's a moderate to low quality stream. And you meet all the 404 and 401 conditions, you're automatically covered. That's the easy answer, right? Because, you know, private homeowners in your project, you're covered, you're good to go. Then there's some that, yeah, it's a higher quality stream, or maybe you put in a, you know, we're protecting the water quality and human health. That's also part of our mission statement. So let's say you have a bunch of concrete slabs and private property or something from somewhere, and then rebars sticking out of it, right? That's dangerous, like kayakers, kids playing extreme, whatever. So that would require, we had to have to remove that. So that's one of our conditions in our 401, you can't put that sort of material in the stream. So we have to review the site and determine that those terms and conditions. But I can email everyone a link to this 401 and the 404 that has those thresholds outlined in there. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
I think we'll give these resources to everybody who signed in. I see a lot of people taking their phone to try to get a snap of the screen, so don't worry, we'll get you this presentation.
Yeah, I'll show the presentation, but I think, but I really good. Yes.
How is Ohio EPA adapting to climate change? For instance, I represent Scott Woods, they.
Yeah.
And, you know, when I first started there 35 years, we have a break the bank incident every 2 years, and now we're getting every year 2, 3, 4, 5 incidents a year. And then the headwaters there, we've been fighting for the last 4 years, a massive housing project that's going to be covering corner to corner hard surface. Okay. So how do you make those adjustments relative to weather and then impacts on construction or tax?
Okay, so that's a question to answer, because as I said, you know, we are very dedicated to state law, right? And currently our legislation that I'm aware does not have any sort of requirements to evaluate projects based on any sort of climate change type issues. I think the federal government has some being developed, maybe Aaron speak to that, but currently under state law and federal law, what's called jurisdictional streams or waters are not under regulation. We as an agency, when that legislation was proposed, we did have our director did present for, I think, the subcommittee or some, I can't remember the name of them, but to try to advise them as to how many water streams we have in the state, how many liter feet, how they provide, you know, water quality, how those impacts could affect water quality downstream, et cetera. But unfortunately, the legislation went in a different direction at that time. But it could change again. I'm not sure where or when, but you know, we as an agency are aware of the impact it's having. But at this time, we don't have any specific rules or laws or guidance on climate change. Okay,
Right.
Any questions?
But as far as the construction goes, you're gonna talk stormwater, right? You're gonna talk about the construction general permit at that point. They all, new development does have, is required to maintain their stormwater pre-enclosed conditions, so whatever's coming out, pre-enclosed. They're constructing. Well, it's not with intention, but they're using old data, you know what? That list comes out, that dictates the amount of water that is stored. That's going up. They'll be average and more.
And all of this water is actually heading towards the scenic island. Change River. So are there any regulations that sort of protect that scenic byway from its watershed?
Full and has its own appendix. So there are requirements to bring stormwater in their dam and the RV as well. But frankly, we're using old data, old precipitation data to model our stormwater. That's really what's causing a lot of the problems we see. Once that, that comes out in 2026, we'll see changes. Currently in development, under design.
So yeah, diving board is some work, and I'm glad you spoke up here. Okay. Yes, okay.
Don't you have authority to investigate cumulative and indirect impacts of under clean water? I know that there's no guidance on it, but I'm just saying.
Yes, no,
Theoretically.
yeah, and I know the core potentially is going to do as well, but we do not have any guidance at this point as to. We do it, there's a case of case review where we can take into consideration indirect impacts and staff reviewing applications and look at like avoided resources and if the proposed development may have an impact on those as well. So it's on case by case, depending on what we see in the application, if we specifically do focus on that. So yes, thank you. Lori's worked with us in the 401 group years ago, so I appreciate that, Lori. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I covered all this goes into this, but under the new 401 law, when I say new, I think it was September 2023, pre-application coordination is required if you're submitting an individual 401 to us. So you have to submit a pre-app to us 30 days before submitting an individual 401. And I think the focus or the intent of that new federal rule was to give us 30 days to become familiar with the project, meet with whomever to discuss mitigation, what's required permitting. So when we get an application in-house, it's better prepared, perhaps has more approvable when it comes in. And now that is a new federal requirement, and it's not everyone's aware of that, but that is a new requirement under a new federal 401 rule. We very strongly encourage you not to submit a 401 application to us until you receive that jurisdictional determination from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and what's called a core public notice, the public notice of the project as well. We go through a 15-day completeness review process where we determine if the application has all the required components as outlined in the Ohio Revised Code to make the application what's called administratively complete. We will come out and do a site visit most likely to verify stream and wetland scoring or categorization. Once the application is complete, the applicant is required to public notice in the newspaper for 1 day, that invites public comment. And a public hearing may be required. It's usually for impacts proposed to higher quality resources, or if there is request from the public for the hearing, then the director will make a decision as to if a public hearing is necessary or not. More than 401 process, once it's complete, we begin our technical review, and that's where we look at proposed mitigation, proposed impacts, indirect impacts, and Laura. And any sort of other technical concerns we may have, we'll issue a technical review comment letter and expect those to be addressed before we move forward with an action of the director or issuance or denying the application. We have, under state law, we have 180 days to take an action on the application. We usually are able to take an action much more quickly than that, especially if the application is well prepared and if we're getting good response time from whomever on items that we would wish to address. Under the new federal 401 rule, the Corps will now set what's called a reasonable period of time for us. So when we deem an application administratively complete, I will email the chief of whatever core district we're dealing with and tell them deem it complete. Then they'll give us what they consider to be a reasonable period of time to take an action. Typically 270 days. This is new. This came out in the new federal 401 rule. The Corps will not tell us what is a reasonable period of time to take an action on the 401 application. And then once the Corps has to wait until we issue the 401 where they issue their Department of the Army 404 permit. And then we have a group that does what's called compliance and mitigation inspections. 3 folks in-house, they get to go out and look at sites that have built stream or wetlands or enhance them to mitigate for impacts. And they determine if the mitigation is meeting the goals that were set in the permit. Okay, how much will it cost? Everyone wants to know how much it will cost, right? All right, so for 401, and these have not changed since the start of the agency 15 years ago. So, 401 application is a $200 what's called application fee. And then we have what's called a review fee, which is based on the amount of impact, right? If you're impacting more, it's gonna be a more thorough review, take more time, so it's more expensive. It's $500 an acre for wetland impacts. Ephemeral, we don't regulate ephemeral streams anymore, so that should be gone. And abandoned streams is $10 a linear foot. Perennial streams is $15 a linear foot. And then lakes is by cubic yard. We have a fee cap of $25,000. So if you have a lot of impacts and you go above that, we'll cap it at 25,000. I've only ever seen coal mines. I've ever seen coal applications hit that. Nobody else ever hits that 25,000. When you submit the application fee of $200 and 1/2 of the review fee is due up front. The rest we'll charge you for with an invoice when we issue or deny. Isolated wetland permit, very similar, $200 application fee, $500 per acre for impacts to isolated wetlands. And then the director's authorization, which is somewhat new to the agency, is a $2,000 set fee paid up front. Okay, mitigation, yes.
What are the limits that you can apply for a director's authorization?
So typically, so a director's authorization is a type of application that folks can submit to us if they do not meet the terms and conditions of the general 401 for the nationwide permits. And so right now, anybody can submit a director's authorization for any term and condition they don't meet. But when we receive it in-house, the first thing we will do is look through the application to determine if we think it's not appropriate to go under the director's authorization, and if an individual 401 should be required. Typically, there are impacts proposed on higher quality resources, if there's what we consider to be an excessive amount of impact, or if looking over it for some reason think we should have a specific 401 with conditions for that project. So maybe the mitigation that they've proposed is not appropriate, or if maybe there's drinking water source issues, or if there's threatened or endangered species issues that we want to condition in the 401. So that's what we would determine. The first thing we'll do is determine if we think it's appropriate under the director's authorization. And then if not, we'll issue a letter saying this. We will require the individual 401 for this. We do have a process in-house for that. Yep. All right, mitigation ratios is dependent upon the wetland quality or category, if it's forested or non-forested. Essentially, you have to do more than what you impact. And the reason for that, I think, is over time, we found a lot of mitigation perhaps isn't meeting the goals, it's not meeting wetland criteria, and our charge under the Clean Water Act is no net loss of wetlands. So if we require more than what was actually impacted, the success rate will hopefully get us to the point where we have that no net loss, right? So it's mitigation ratio here, and that's spelled out in this third column. The last column is the wetland quality. So if you do wetland mitigation, it has to at least meet category 2 using the VIVI. That is your goal. We have different levels of isolated wetland permitting, depending on the wetland category you're impacting and the acreage. General permit, level 1, that's the easier one, 30 days, we can pop that out. Level 2 is for impacts over ½ acre but less than 3 of category 1 or 2 wetlands. And that's called a level 2 review. It's an individual permit, and it's a 90-day turnaround from when we have a complete application. Level 3 isolated wetland permit applications for impacts over 3 acres or impacting category 3 wetland, which is the nicest of the nice. And that is a individual permit, again, 180-day turnaround from a date we gave it complete. All right, so we as a state, of course, we're the ones that regulate only isolated wetlands, and this is trying to demonstrate here the importance of our isolated wetland permitting program in the state of Ohio. So this is from 2002 to 2022. This shows you the type of permits we've issued and how many. So you can see in the early 2000s, we issued more 401s than isolated wetlands, right? Starting 2013, that's when we first put that director's authorization option in our 401 for the nationwide. So we started issuing director's authorizations. We got a lot of those, right, for a while there. And then in 2020 is when there's a navigable protection waters rule. So the waters of the US rule became the navigable protection waters rule. A lot more waters were isolated. So you can see the big bump in isolated wetland permits we were getting, right, as a result of that. That's what's in blue there. And also the court considered us waived on certain nationwide as of 2021, is we were getting less director's authorizations in as well. That's why you're seeing that the drop down in what's red there. So we got a lot more isolated wetland applications because of the changes in federal rules determining what is federally jurisdictional under state regulations. That's why we're seeing a big bump here, in that type of application. That's why it's very important that the state of Ohio has these isolated wetland rules in place, because some states don't, right? Now, a lot of states that have this, these wetlands are no longer federally jurisdictional or under the Corps jurisdiction. So it's good that we as a state have such good isolated wetland rules, because now we have a path to permitting these what are now waters of the state impacts. All right, so as I said, our world is dictated by rule and law, and it's changed a lot, right? Especially federally in the last few years. So what's being done now? How are we adapting to these changes, right? I've been around for a while now, so things have changed. I have to adapt to the changes, just like everyone else. So we have now a lot more sites that the Corps is now issuing. It's called approved jurisdictional determinations. It's a jurisdictional determination saying if something is or is not isolated, rather than the Corps is taking jurisdiction over everything. So we're getting a lot more of those as well. But also with the Sackett decision, which was a legal decision that came from the Supreme Court on a private property owner that I think was building a house on the lake somewhere out west. And they were saying that these wetlands were federally jurisdictional, and the Sackett family hired some attorneys, and they were of the opinion that it was not federally jurisdictional. But what came forth from that was what's called the Sackett decision, and that changed what the considered federally jurisdictional waters, right? That had a big change on what we regulate, what's regulated federally versus under state jurisdictions. Now there's a lot more wetlands under state jurisdiction. So we have now more, the 401 crew is now bigger than we've ever had before. We have more staff trying to handle this with permit inload that we have coming in. And then we also have to, we have quite a few more regional general permits that we've developed to try to handle impacts that are more minimal in nature, right? We issued one recently for ODNR, Division of Mineral Resource Management, the Abandoned Minelands Group. So we're now authorizing, they got a lot of federal money to restore or fix areas that were impacted by what's called pre-smacro mining. So mining that took place, strip mining that took place for surface mining laws were in place. And so they have a lot of money to fix these, federal money that came in to fix these areas. And so we developed a general permit, because we would have got a lot of permits from them to try to mitigate or to permit those proposed impacts, right? So we developed a general permit to address that workload, because we wanted to encourage that sort of work, right? Because a lot of these pre-log mining impacts, it results in acid mine drainage, abandoned high walls, that sort of thing. So we really do want to try to encourage that sort of remediation, as we developed a general permit for that. And we've also discussed in-house of developing a state mitigation bank for impacts to isolated wetlands, because right now all banks are for jurisdictional or isolated. We're trying to see if we can have a more streamlined process for isolated wetland permitting to banking directly that. That's been also a discussion that we've been having in-house. All right, I discussed Sackett already, so I think we breeze this. But one big thing of I talked about Sackett. But also a big thing that came through in the last few years on the state level was House Bill 175. And now ephemeral streams are no longer under state regulation as well. They are no longer considered waters of the state, and they are not something that we as a state can permit impacts to or regulate impacts to. That's a big change. Since I've been with the agency, we regulated all stream impacts, whether it be perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral. Now ephemeral are no longer considered waters of the US.
But only the Army Corps can make the determination of whether something is impermeable or not. So you still have to have the Army Corps. We can't make that determination of whether something's impermeable. We can't make the determination by what we're seeing. We have to have that determination by the Army Corps saying it's ephemeral.
Yeah, the Corps will call it non-relatively permanent water, but yes, ephemeral streams, correct. The Corps will make that call. Good point. Thank Linda. Thank you. She's seen me talk before.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So now we have to adapt within the agency. So we've updated rules, right, to reflect these new state and federal changes, right, to law. So we've updated our water quality standards. So our wetland anti-deg section has had some updates recently as of July 21st, 2024. And then also brand sparkling new, I mentioned this a bit earlier, We have now a stream mitigation or stream assessment method. It's called OSAM, Ohio Stream Assessment Method. And it was effective just a couple months ago, August 1st, 2024. Brand new method, really interesting. I haven't seen an application yet that has used it, but it's out there. It's on our website. I can email you a link. I'm really interested to see this used. So it's not a tool to determine stream quality, right? We got that down. We have that done at Ohio EPA, right? This tool, you go out and you measure certain parameters in the field, and you put that data into a spreadsheet, and it tells you your credits and debits. Essentially, it tells you, okay, you're impacting this much linear footage, the stream is this quality based on these measurements taken in the field, and it pops out, this is the credit, and this is how much is owed for mitigation. That's what this tool does. It tells you your credit debit ratio, essentially, or credit debit. So it's a tool that's based on the Georgia Stream Quantification Tool, and it uses the stream functional pyramid. So we adapted it for use in Ohio. It's still undergoing. There's two groups that are still looking through this method in great detail, looking at the technical aspects of it. People from the Corps are in these groups, from ODR, Ohio EPA. I'm not on it. I handle permitting, but some of our other folks in-house are sitting in on these meetings. The tool is still under revision. We do have a tool in rule, but it will be changed, right? As we adapt to it or see what works for use in Ohio. I can't speak a lot about it, it's not on the group, yes.
So, like a stream restoration project is a 319, I mean, is that something that is eligible for a credit?
Yes, so the
Yeah,
project.
how does that get banked and it's overall scheme?
Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so if the 319 project, the 319 is the type of grant that Ohio EPA administers for stream or I'm not in the group, but it's any sort of project that's proposing stream enhancement or wetland work, et cetera. So let's say you have a project that they're doing, they're taking a channelized stream and they're like putting meanders in it or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly what.
Okay, that's in that line. Okay, so let's say, but that's fill, right? Because they're filling in what was a stream and moving it essentially. That would require permitting. It would probably go under what's called nationwide permit 27.
We have
before.
that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but we didn't need to go, I mean, did the 401.
The 401 for nationwide.
Happened as in code, what was the word, like, those were reviewed together in order to get that.
So what-
Correct?
So what the Corps will do is they'll take that project, they'll look for it under 27, they'll look at our 401 for nationwide permit 27, they'll say, oh, it meets the 401 for nationwide permit 27. So we won't get anything at the end. I'll never see it.
Oh, okay.
Because the Corps will make that determination.
Okay.
But our 401 for nationwide permit 27 is wide open. Like we allow almost all impacts, because we want to encourage the use of that. Nationwide. So nationwide permit 27 is aquatic habitat restoration, enhancement, and something. What was it?
Rehabilitation.
Thank you. Yes. All right. So yeah, we want to encourage the use of that nationwide because it's fixing streams, it's enhancing streams. So we allow a lot of impacts under that because the goal is aquatic habitat restoration. So we don't even see it. The Corps makes that determination. But you could use this tool. You could go out and there's quite a few measurements that be taken in the field, like faithful width, flood-prone width, other sorts of measurements in the field. And then you put all that in this, it's a spreadsheet, a macro-named spreadsheet. You could put all that in the spreadsheet and say, okay, this is your impact. And it would pop out what is required for a debit. This is what is required, or their debit credit. It would say how much linear footage is required. You would put in your proposed mitigation, put in those calculations, and it would tell you if what you're doing meets the requirements of that tool. The Corps is not required the use of that for nationwide at this time. Because we also have, if you look at that section of OAC 374532 B4, it also outlines that we will also accept mitigation assessment or mitigation proposals acceptable to the director. And so at this time, we've not required use of OSAM for applications. We will accept it. We also will accept the alternative, which is what you've been doing in the past, right? People have submitted applications. This is my impact. This is my proposed mitigation is. We're still accepting those at this time. But you could have used this tool for it, yes. Okay. Yeah. And so we look at three different components from the stream functional pyramid. When the one on the right is what we in the state of Ohio are using right now. We're looking at measurements that tell us biology, geomorphology, and hydraulics of the stream. The different measurements we have a manual on what measurements to collect to put into that spreadsheet to give you us the numbers of credit and debits. All right, I'm almost done. A couple more slides. All right, the new 401 rule, as I said, has had changes to how we as an program operate. We do require a pre-filing meeting request 30 days prior to an individual 401 being submitted. And that is considered step 2, request for certification. We'll email the Corps. They'll set that reasonable period of time. Step 3, Then we as an agency will do a technical review or an analysis of the application, and then we'll make a certification decision. So under the federal 401 rule, we can grant or deny or waive the application. All right, couple tips. Hire a consultant, super helpful. Plan ahead. This process, especially for bigger projects, can take an entire year, right? Go out, delineate the site, do the permitting, work with us. It could take a year. Schedule a meeting with us prior to submitting your application. Pre-application meetings, we can go through what's needed, try to streamline the process, answer questions. Always better to do that up front. When you submit to us, make sure it's complete, because that will streamline the process for us and organize prior to submitting, right? Then also we very strongly encourage all folks, if possible, to minimize your impacts to meet the nationwide permits and the 401 for the nationwide permits, the much more streamlined permitting process. And it also minimizes impacts to water resources, right? Okay, that is all I had, and that's my name. I'm Rachel Seacrest, the 401 permitting supervisor at the Ohio EPA. And as I said, I'm going to email this PowerPoint to Dave and Brooke, and she will get out to folks. I also will email you links to some of these general permits that has those threshold limitations that I think were discussed. That would be helpful for you as well. All right, any other questions for me? I smell food, so I think go any further. Okay.
Yeah, I think I don't know, I didn't see any questions in the chat. If you don't see
I
anything
didn't see
from folks
any.
that are on virtually. If you have any questions, feel free, but yeah, we'll take a little break, feel free to stretch your legs, grab some pizza. The first row here is some veggies, these are pepperoni, so if you like. We'll get our next presenter set up here, hopefully he can get his audio, make sure he's coming through good. We'll be here in about that. Okay.
Think so.
Let's get started back to it. Now we have the four here from, looks like we got Andrew. Is that correct? And Andrew, you can hear us and everything okay?
Yep, I can hear you guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I think so. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, great. So the first thing I'd like to say is I'd like to thank Rachel for everything that she said. She put out a lot of good information. I was able to almost hear all of it. Like I said, I was on the phone during that. So you're going to see through this that there is a large amount of overlap between what the Corps does. Rachel mentioned kind of our role in this process a lot. So some of this may seem a little repetitive, but there are some nuanced differences between our programs. So if you have any questions, just please feel free to jump in at any time and ask. With that, I'll get started. I am not Teresa Spagna. My name is Andrew Wendt. I am a project manager here in the Huntington District. I've been here for about 11 years. I've been with the Corps for about 12 or 13, so I've been doing this a little bit. I'm out of the Cincinnati office, so I work in that area of Ohio. So yeah, with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Yeah. There we go. So I'm sorry, what was that?
Over outside. Sorry, we've got a little leaf blower action happening outside the window, so.
Oh, okay. Okay. So yeah, so Rachel kind of mentioned this too, and like I said, we have similar programs, and the Corps' regulatory mission is we try to protect the nation's aquatic resources. We're concerned with the chemical, biological, and physical integrity of those resources, and we do it through the way we evaluate permits and permit actions. So it's a little bit different. This is the districts that are active in Ohio. The white area is the Huntington district. The green area is the Buffalo district, and the purple area is the Pittsburgh district. So there's actually, like as the slide shows, there's 3 different districts in the state of Ohio. Huntington has the largest portion of Ohio, but depending on where you're located, you may have some other districts who would handle any sort of regulatory or jurisdictional concerns that you might have. So the Corps has primarily 2 authorities that we regulate under. Section 404 is the bottom one there. Rachel touched on that quite a bit. That regulates the discharge of dredged and/or fill material into waters of the United States. The Corps also has authority under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. This primarily covers navigable waters, so I'm not sure with this audience if there's too many people that would be involved in projects that would be subject to Section 10. But Section 10 regulates any work in, on, above, or below a Section 10 waterway. So there was a question earlier about boring. If you're dealing with primarily a Section 404 water, and that's most of the streams, wetlands, and aquatic resources in Ohio, you only need a permit if you discharge dredged and/or fill material into that resource. But a Section 10 authority, like I said, even work underneath that water body would require a permit from the Corps. So if you were to bore under a Section 10 water, you would still need a permit from the Corps. I don't know if there's any questions on that. So this is talking about Section 10. Sorry, go ahead.
Andrew, there is a question.
Is there a minimum depth, like the depth required on boring? Like how deep you can go or how, what minimum you have to?
You hear that, Andrew? You hear that?
Yeah, so I think it was a question on whether or not there's a depth limitation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's not really a limitation on, when it comes to a Section 10 waterway, there's not really a limitation on any depth or the area above a Section 10 waterway where we would say it's not covered by our activity. So when you're dealing with a Section 10, if you're going to bore under it, you're going to need a permit regardless of whether or not you're a few feet underneath a Section 10 waterway or you're 100 feet under a Section 10 waterway. You would still need a permit for a Section 10 waterway to be covered for that. Like I said, that's not usually something I think in this audience we see too much. Most of the time when we're dealing with Section 10 waterways and boring, it's for commercial water lines or commercial utility lines. But I guess it could come up in this arena. So just be aware of that. It's not necessarily the discharge of fill on a Section 10 waterway. With most of the streams and wetlands and aquatic resources that you guys are dealing with, if you bore underneath it, it's not an action that the Corps would regulate. So I hope that answers the question. So this kind of this slide just goes over what a Section 10 waterway is. Like I said, it's primarily a navigable waterway. In the state of Ohio for the Huntington district, you're primarily dealing with some of the major rivers in this area. So this lists the most common ones. If you get into northern Ohio, you're going to deal with Lake Erie and some of the waterways up there. But like I said, in the Huntington district, it's primarily just the main rivers in the state of Ohio. So this kind of goes over what the Corps does, and Rachel touched on a lot of this. One of our primary issues, is determining jurisdictional status of a water of the United States. So usually the first step in any process with the Corps of Engineers and, conversely getting to the Ohio EPA is the review of a jurisdictional determination and a determination on whether or not a aquatic resource is federally jurisdictional or not subject to the federal government's jurisdiction. So that's the first thing we do. We also issue permits. We have various levels of permits, nationwide permits, standard individual permits, and letters of permission are primarily the ones we use. Nationwide permits make up a vast majority of the actions that the Corps reviews, but we do get a fair number of individual permits as well. We deal with our permitting and the results or the outcomes of that permit through mitigation, compliance, and enforcement. These are post-permit actions typically. Mitigation is pretty self-explanatory. There are limits on the amount of aquatic resource that can be impacted, and if you exceed that, mitigation is required through our program. Compliance actions are what we do for almost any action that we issue. We will go out and just make sure that the project was done as it was submitted. And enforcement actions are what we deal with on projects that don't come to us correctly and are done without authorization. Duties as assigned, these outreach, site visits, this type of activity is something that, like these type of programs are also something we deal with quite regularly. So what is a jurisdictional water? Under the current guidance right now, and Rachel touched on this as well, there's been a lot of changes to the definitions of waters in the United States over the past 7 to 8 years. But currently, this is the one that we are currently under. So these are the lists of jurisdictional waters that are currently in effect in the state of Ohio. Traditional navigable waters, those are primarily your Section 10 waters. Interstate waters, any water that crosses state boundaries, other waters, impoundments, tributaries, territorial seas, and adjacent wetlands. There's a large amount of non-jurisdictional waters. Rachel touched on those as well. I don't think this presentation goes into that too much, but basically anything that doesn't fall under the categories of jurisdictional waters outlined above would be a non-jurisdictional water. I don't know if I should pause for questions on this. Sometimes there are questions about what is a non-jurisdictional water. So if anybody has any questions, I'll just take a second to see if there is any.
Yeah, there's a question, Andrew.
Little more broad. Can you, like, if there is a non-jurisdictional water, can you still take it to the other water, under jurisdictional and fit it in that criteria? Like, can you do that? It's a broad spectrum when you say other waters. Can you fit a non-jurisdictional water into that other waters of jurisdictional waters?
And I'll let you speak to that, because that's a core question. Did you hear the question, Andrew?
I heard some of it, but I don't know if I got it completely. If someone could summarize that for me, that'd be great.
So when you put that other waters under jurisdiction water of A3, so it makes, can we categorize any non-jurisdictional water into other waters and fit into that definition?
Okay. Yeah. So yep, I understand your question now. So not necessarily. Sorry. But what the Corps can do is there's different types of jurisdictional determinations that the Corps does. And I'm actually going to get into this on the next slide. So I think the next slide will start to answer your question if you just indulge me for 1 second. So this slide explains the the Corps of Engineers puts out what's called regulatory guidance letters, and those are letters that we issue to the general public on just the guidance on how the Corps proceeds with requests, actions, how we evaluate. One of the last ones we did was on jurisdictional determinations and the type of JDs that the Corps can do. To answer your question, the most common type of JD that the Corps does is what is called a PJD. It's a preliminary jurisdictional determination. Under a PJD, the Corps can assume jurisdiction of any type of aquatic resource if you ask us to do so. So to answer your question, if you have other waters that are maybe non-jurisdictional, but you'd like the Corps to regulate them as jurisdictional, you can request a PJD from the Corps and we will assume jurisdiction over that resource. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. So that's something that the Corps does, and it's relatively common. If people just don't want to go through an AJD process, or for one reason or another, they will request the Corps assume jurisdiction over any aquatic resource, and the Corps will accommodate that request if a landowner does request that. So we get a lot of JD requests. That's probably one of the biggest actions we get. Permits are probably a close second, but we get a ton of JD requests because there's a lot of questions over what is jurisdictional and what is not. And determining what is and is not jurisdictional is really the first step in kind of directing you down what the appropriate action is to move forward with your project. So one of the important things to remember about JD requests with the Corps is they are not necessarily prioritized by the Corps. We have to prioritize permit actions that come with us. So if you submit to us a standalone JD request, it doesn't always get the fastest turnaround that some people would like. So it can take a little bit of time for the Corps to process a JD request. If you submit that JD request with a permit action though, so if you need a permit as well, it tends to move the JD process along because we have pretty strict timelines to review permit requests. So just keep that in mind that if you submit just a standalone jurisdictional determination request to the Corps, sometimes they do take a little bit of time to return the responses with those. Some of that also has to do with the type of JD request you submit to the Corps. If you submit just a PJD request, just a preliminary jurisdictional determination, basically requesting that the Corps assume jurisdiction of any aquatic resource within your subject site, those tend to be turned around relatively quickly. If you submit an AJD, which is an approved jurisdictional determination, those can take a little bit longer. The difference between an AJD and a PJD is the word preliminary with a PJD just means that we either are agreeing to assume jurisdiction over your aquatic resource, and we generally agree with your delineation report. Some people get turned off by this language. They don't like it, that when we say those are non-appealable, generally what that means is just that there's no timeline for expiration on them. They're non-appealable, but they can be modified almost at any time. Approved jurisdictional determinations are a little bit different. Those have appeal rights with them and they're valid for 5 years. Some resources can only be covered under an AJD, and that's if you ask the court to make a non-jurisdictional determination on a resource. So if you submit a delineation report to us, anything that you say is jurisdictional to the Corps, we can cover that under a PJD. If you say something is non-jurisdictional to the Corps, we can only cover that under an AJD, and there's a little bit more involved in our review of that. It requires some interagency coordination, but AJDs are final, they're appealable, but they're only valid for 5 years. So just the little bit of difference between those. Sorry, is there a question?
Oh, there's a call. That's all.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, there's no question, Andrew. Someone just coughed and.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's the consequence of a virtual meeting. No worries. So this goes into the approved JDs a little bit. And like I said, this is a formal determination by the Corps. You can request an AJD for any type of resource. I should have clarified that. If you have a resource that you believe is jurisdictional, you can request an approved jurisdictional determination on that. Most project managers with the Corps in that situation are going to kind of direct you to go to a PJD in those. PJDs have a lot of benefit to them, but some people are worried about it not having that approved or formal determination from the Corps. And what I try to explain to people is with a PJD, if you think something is jurisdictional, it is really helpful for you to have that, because when the Corps issues a PJD, we're saying we generally agree with your delineation. We agree to regulate this resource, and it helps you start planning, but it doesn't necessarily lock you in necessarily to that JD. If something changes, it is very easy to modify those, where it's not as easy with an approved JD for positive jurisdictional resources. However, just to make sure I'm getting this point home, for non-jurisdictional resources, an AJD is the only avenue that we have for that. So this is a preliminary JD, and like I said, this is just kind of what I was talking about here. These are generally the most beneficial type of JDs for resources that are jurisdictional, or in instances where you'd like the Corps to assume jurisdiction over a resource. They are great for planning purposes. They're easily done by the Corps, and they're easily modified if situations change or if site conditions change, and they really help you move the process along with the Corps. So I don't know if anybody has any questions on those types of JDs or the benefits to one versus the other. But if you do, just please let me know. So this is an action that resulted as a result of that regal that I mentioned, 1601. The Corps also has the ability to issue no JD whatsoever. So if you submit a request to the Corps for a permit action, and it has a delineation report, and you have aquatic resources on site, you've requested a permit action for those resources, the Corps does not have to issue a JD in order to move that action forward. So just keep that in mind that, we've received requests from people where they're requesting a permit from the Corps. They submit a delineation report with their request, and the Corps processes it, and we issue a permit, and then the applicant comes back and says, I didn't see a JD with this. The Corps does not have to issue JDs in those instances and on sites where everything is just assumed jurisdictional. So if you want a JD, it is something that you have to specifically request in some of those instances, but it's not always necessary for us to move your process along. Are there any questions on that?
Nope.
Okay. Coordination, this is kind of what I mentioned with AJDs. So certain actions, if you request an AJD, and this is pretty relevant to this area, is non-jurisdictional wetlands. If you submit a delineation report to the Corps and you have non-jurisdictional wetlands and you're requesting the Corps issue an AJD on that, we do have to coordinate that with the US EPA and Corps headquarters per our standing agreements with US EPA and guidance from our headquarters. So basically what that means is on my end, I will do the determinations documentation up. I will send that to the US EPA. They have 10 days to review and respond. If they have questions or comments, they can come back to the applicant and ask for clarification, additional information. But that's just a required part of that process. And that's why AJDs tend to take longer than the other types of JDs, than a PJD or a no JD required request that we have. So that's just something to be aware of with our process. We are not the sole decision makers always for certain types of resources under our JDs. So these are common Section 10 activities. I'll briefly touch on these, but this isn't a common request that we get from this area. But like I said, when you have a Section 10 waterway, the Ohio River is a very common one to think of. Any activity on that river requires a permit from the Corps through Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. So like utility lines going over, utility lines going under, anything directly on the river, boat docks, those type of things, very common for Section 10. Section 404 makes up probably, I'd say, about 85 to 90% of the requests that we get in the Corps. And Section 404, as Rachel touched on earlier, deals with the discharge of dredged and or fill material. So that's an important distinction. A lot of people just say fill material, but it's important to distinguish that it's the discharge of dredged and or fill material. Basically just any solid material that you put into the waterway, that's going to be fill material. But the discharge of dredge material, sometimes that throws people for a loop. And I think there was a question earlier about, open cut trenching through a wetland. That could be looked at as dredged or fill because you're pulling that material up and you're putting it back down. So that's just what that wording means. We have various levels of permits. The highest level of permit that we have is a standard individual permit. This is something that causes a more than minimal adverse effect to the aquatic environment. There's not a very defined line, but there's the general limits that I tell people is half an acre. Most impacts under half an acre usually have a nationwide permit associated with them. But if you're exceeding the limits of a nationwide permit, our only answer there is a standard permit. Or if you have a type of activity that isn't covered by an existing nationwide permit, then it has to be a standard individual permit. Letters of permission, that's a type of activity that covers Section 10 waters. If there's not necessarily a nationwide permit that covers the type of activity on a Section 10 water that you're looking to do, we can do a letter of permission. They're kind of an in between a nationwide permit and a standard permit. But like I said, they only cover Section 10 activities. Regional general permits. These are like nationwide permits, but they're issued regionally by either a district or a division. These are meant to cover a specific type of activity in a region that nationwide permits don't cover. But nationwide permits, those are the vast majority of the actions that the Corps does in the state of Ohio. These are meant to cover projects with minimal individual and cumulative impacts to the aquatic resources. There's, I believe, 57 of them right now issued in the state of Ohio. These are issued on a 5-year basis, and they tend to cover the most common type of activities: commercial developments, residential developments, linear transportation, bank stabilization, utility lines, stuff of that nature. Each individual nationwide permit has different criteria to it and has different limitations to it. So those documents on what is currently available in the state of Ohio is very easy to find. If you just Google nationwide permits for the state of Ohio, you can find, it's usually the first PDFs that come up, or you can use the link at the bottom of this slide and it'll take you to the current nationwide permits which are active in the state of Ohio. One of the things that I wanted to touch on, I kind of heard this question earlier on, was about notifying the Corps or notifying the agencies of when you need to use these permits. If you look at the PDFs that are out there, every nationwide permit has a paragraph underneath it that says notification criteria. And I think the question earlier was on nationwide permit 13 for bank stabilization, and Rachel kind of mentioned the 500 linear foot notification criteria on that. There are some other ones for that. So if you have a question about notification criteria, if you go to that documentation, it will tell you what the notification criteria is for that specific nationwide permit. One of the things that I will touch on with the Corps, and I think there's some slides on this later on, is in addition to the notification criteria under each nationwide permit, the nationwide permits have general conditions at the end of the document, which apply to all nationwide permits. Some of those general conditions have additional notification criteria on them, so it's important to really take a look at those. The two that I try to highlight to everyone are endangered species actions, or actions that impact an endangered species, or actions that impact a cultural or historic resource. If you have a project that has the potential to impact a federally threatened or endangered species, that automatically triggers notification to the Corps. Same with a cultural or historic property that's potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. If you have a project that's going to potentially impact one of those resources, it's an automatic notification. You're going to check the box that you need to notify the Corps. So as I said, there's currently 2 sets of nationwide permits active in the state of Ohio. It is not usual for the Corps to have 2 sets, and I believe we're going to get this back to one single document on the next iteration of the nationwide permits. But here are the 2 active nation. Was there a question or?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
One question.
Oh, go ahead.
Why in the world you would have 2 sets of nationwide permits? 1 year.
Are you asking?
You asked, Laura Fay asked why there are 2 sets of nationwide permits, Andrew.
Yeah, so I believe this just came down to when they were actually published in the Federal Register, and some of the interagency coordination that was going on when we were trying to get these issued. We try not to let them lapse or expire, so we always try to make sure that they overlap so there's not an issue with people using them. And I think this came down to just some interagency coordination, internal coordination. So we ended up issuing 2 sets. The main difference between the two, and Rachel, feel free to jump in if you want to talk about this one, but the issue that has the bottom set, the 2022 nationwide permits, has 41 sets of nationwide permits on it. It has the 401 water quality certification applicable in the state of Ohio. But due to some timing issues, the top one, the 2021 nationwide permits, doesn't currently have the 401 water quality standards similar to the 2022 ones. So like I said, this was just mainly an administrative issue, why we have two sets issued. If you look at the dates on them, they're very, they're not too far apart from one another. And like I said, I think it was just an administrative issue when we were trying to get these out in time.
So are there some that are not certified and some that are?
There are 16 nationwide
Yeah.
permits. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers considers the state waived on yes.
Yep.
Correct.
Well,
So what that,
it's actions, because then you have to review these, right?
Well, there's two. It's tricky because you do have to look at two. But I will say these 16 are the most commonly used ones. But yeah, if you have a project, yes, there are two sets that need to be reviewed. But the Corps will do it, right? You'll submit the form to the Corps, and then the Corps will review is what the 30, I can't remember the number of the form. The Corps will review your application form to determine the appropriate nationwide permit. They're the ones that will look for these to see which one fits.
And which ones did you waive?
The Corps considers Ohio EPA waived on the 2021 nationwide permits, 16 most commonly used ones, yes. The Corps considers
Yep.
those.
So yeah, what Rachel said is correct there. So the first thing is when you submit a permit of an action to the Corps has the authority to determine what nationwide permit, if that is what we're going to look at it under, is most appropriate for your request. So it doesn't happen very often, but there are times where someone will submit a type of project to us, and the Corps reviewer will determine that, you know, it's better suited to fall under a certain type of nationwide as opposed to maybe the one that was requested. Excuse me. As Rachel said, the 16 nationwide permits, the Corps currently considers the 401 waived on those. So if you had a project that came in, you know, let's say a nationwide permit 39 for a commercial development, we would consider that the state waived the 401 water quality certification on that. So we would say that is not a necessary component for us to issue our nationwide permit. So I don't know if there's going to be additional questions on that, but that is I generally get questions on that. That doesn't typically happen where we consider the 401 waived by a state, and I think on the next go around, I don't anticipate that being the issue when we issue our next set.
And will the next set be combined?
Getting into that's so the next set should be coming out around 2026. That is when, like I said, the nationwide permits are issued on a national basis, and they're issued on a 5-year rotation. So every 5 years, the Corps goes through the decision document making process of issuing these permits on a 5-year basis. We can only issue them for 5 years, and every 5 years we review them, modify them, and just, you know, take a look at making them more applicable to the types of activities that we see very commonly. What we do during that process, it's a pretty long process. It usually starts up about a year before we get ready to issue them, sometimes sooner. And in that review time, we are usually coordinating with the states to put any regional conditions onto those nationwide permits and any water quality certification requirements onto specific nationwide permits. So 2026 is about when you should start see the next set of nationwide permits come out. So what do you need to do to apply for a permit? The first thing, if you're applying for a nationwide permit, is you have to submit a pre-construction notification to the Corps. You can look at the phrase pre-construction notification as it just basically means an application. What is needed for a pre-construction notification? It kind of depends on the level of activity that you're doing. If you are doing, we have certain things that you have to check the box on, that you have to submit some information for, but the level of detail that has to go into each category of information that we need to review really depends on the level of your project. So the Corps has a PCN document. It's engineering form 6082. I'll go over that. This is this document right here. This is what's considered a nationwide permit pre-construction notification form. And if you read through this, this is not required to submit for a nationwide permit, but it is highly encouraged for you to fill this document out, as it generally will outline everything that we are looking for a nationwide permit. The front of it's pretty standard on who's applying. If you have an agent or a consultant, they can put all their information there. This is where it starts to really get important though, because if you start looking at some of these categories, this is the level of information that we need to assign a nationwide permit, review your nationwide permit, and determine if it would qualify for one of those nationwide permits. And like I said, we get these a lot, and people think that if you just fill out this form, it's sufficient. But what I'm trying to point out is it really depends on the type of project you're doing. For example, if you are just putting a utility line, a water line across a very low level stream, you might need to submit a PCN for that, but we probably don't need a book report level of information on what you're doing. It's a pretty common activity. But if you're developing a whole commercial, a 200 acre commercial development, you're probably not going to be able to explain what you're doing in these boxes. So you're probably going to have to submit a more comprehensive document with that. But like I said, this will just lay out what type of information we are looking for as we're reviewing. And this is the one that I kind of touched on a little bit earlier. Some of these talk about threatened and endangered species and cultural resources. It may not seem like it, but that is a big part of the Corps' review when we are reviewing an action. So a lot of times when we get these, people will just put, under cultural resources, not applicable, no cultural resources. And it's important to remember that the Corps has to consider the potential to impact any known or unknown cultural resources. So if you're doing, like I said, this goes also back to the size of your project. If you're doing a relatively small project, a linear stream crossing, the installation of a utility line, probably pretty unlikely that there's anything in that area. But if you're doing something that's really, a larger based area project, even if you just look at, a known map of potential resources in the area, it's probably not going to be sufficient. Usually we need a preliminary resource review at a bare minimum. And when it comes to threatened and endangered species, most people aren't really aware of what's in their immediate vicinity in terms of threatened and endangered species. The ones that we always had to caution people about are the threatened or endangered bat species in the state of Ohio. If you have basically a tree on your property and you're going to modify that tree or cut it down, the Fish and Wildlife Service considers that to be potential habitat for probably one of the bat species in the area. So just something to consider with that. One of the things we recommend is for both of these resources, you can go to the Fish and Wildlife Service and request a preliminary resource review from them. If you do that and you submit that to us, a lot of times if they say that they don't have any additional concerns or they don't need any additional work from you, we can usually accept that as sufficient level of information for our review to move forward with that process. Similarly, with the State Historic Preservation Office, you can go onto their website and you can request that they do a preliminary review of your project. You have to submit a little bit of information to them, and they'll let you know whether or not there's any known resources in this area, whether or not they have additional concerns. But if they give you a letter that says that they've reviewed your project, they don't have any concerns, you don't need to coordinate with their office anymore, you can submit that letter to our office with your PCN, and that usually checks the box of what we have to look at for your project. So I always encourage people to try to do that as early as possible, because it's the fastest way to let you know what you're going to need for those two things. And if it comes back and they say they don't have any concerns and no additional coordinations necessary from your office, it makes the review on our end much quicker.
Hey, Andrew, there was a question on that, I believe. Yes, Andrew, my question
Okay.
was, if you have, recent information on an endangered mussel in an area where there's, potential for, crossing in that section across the river, it's like, my question is, how quickly does that information get, translated? Like, it has to be confirmed, then it has to be moved, and then, it's like, so we have, I mean, I'm just wondering what that process looks like to get an alert as to an evaluation before this review would go through.
Yeah, so this is how that would work. If you had a project that was going across a perennial stream, if you did a mussel survey ahead of time, you would submit that to my office, and if there was something that was found that was federally threatened or endangered, or something along those lines, we would coordinate that with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They would be the ones who would primarily make the decision on whether or not there needs to be a relocation of those mussel species. If you had a federally threatened or endangered species, we may have to institute formal consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But that would primarily be handled through our office. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a very good handle on where federally threatened and endangered mussels are located in the state of Ohio. So typically we don't see too many mussel surveys done without the direction of the Fish and Wildlife Service. I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, I mean, this is like almost confirmed recent developments, so that's why I'm trying to figure out what we would need to do to be able to act on that.
Okay, so if you have a project coming up and you've discovered a federally threatened or endangered mussel species, that's going to get resolved through my office if you have to submit for a permit for that action, because you would submit that mussel survey to me, and when I submit that up to the Fish and Wildlife Service, I have to make an effect determination on federally threatened or endangered species. If you have them present in the project area, it's going to be a may affect determination. It may be an adverse effect determination. So the process of resolving that is going to come out through my coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So you can go ahead and notify the Fish and Wildlife Service ahead of time to kind of see if you can get the ball moving a little bit quicker, but the formal resolution of that is going to result from my coordination with their office.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so mitigation is a big question that we get quite a bit. When is mitigation required? What do I have to do for mitigation? Rachel touched on this to a good extent earlier. So this is the Corps' thresholds for mitigation. It's currently over 0.3 acre of stream bed loss and over 1/10 of an acre of wetland loss. So if you have one or the other of those, you're going to have to mitigate for the loss of that aquatic resource. Streams used to be in the linear foot arena for measuring whether or not mitigation was required, but recently we switched it to an acreage based assessment on when mitigation is required. That said, when it comes to streams, if you exceed the acreage limitation for stream impacts and you require mitigation, we still look at it usually on a linear foot basis for how much you need to mitigate. Wetlands is still acreage based. We are required as part of our review to make sure that a project goes through the sequence approach to mitigation, that you avoid, minimized, and then you mitigate for the lost resource. Rachel also touched on this. There is a hierarchy to mitigation in what we can and how we can improve things. The preferred method is mitigation banks, and then we look at in lieu fee programs, and then permittee responsible. The Corps does have some discretionary authority on deviating from this hierarchy if we can justify that deviation, and I can go into that if people have questions on that. But generally, if you're in a watershed that has mitigation bank credits available in the primary service area, we're going to direct you to there. Same with, and it just goes down the list. If there's no mitigation banks, but there's an in lieu fee, we're going to direct you to that. If there's neither, we can look at permitting responsible, or we can look at, service areas outside of your project. So I don't know if there's any questions on that, just let me know. So this is deed restrictions or conservation easements. We don't get a ton of permitting responsible mitigation anymore. So, but when we do, like I said, that's the bottom of the hierarchy and the preferred method for mitigation. But if you do request that the Corps approve permitting responsible mitigation, either because of a lack of credits or we decide that it's the preferred method for mitigation, you are generally going to be required to put some sort of deed restriction or conservation easement on that area. So just keep that in mind. It's not something that we do very often anymore. We still do some PRM, but I would say the vast majority of our mitigation requirements right now are handled through mitigation banks and in lieu fees. Flowage easements, same kind of thing with the last thing. It's not something that we deal with very often. Yeah, if anybody has any questions on this, I'll get to this, but this is not usually something that is brought up in this audience. Floodplain considerations. We get questions a lot about floodplains and when the Corps is involved with floodplains. The Corps, while we deal a lot with resources that are located in floodplains, the floodplains don't always play a huge role in when we get involved with a project. And I don't know if that makes sense as I say it, but what I'm saying is we get a lot of calls for activities where people are letting us know that somebody's doing something in the floodplain. And it's not always necessarily something that the Corps has involvement in. If you're within a floodplain, you may have to coordinate with some other federal agencies, but just because you are in a floodplain doesn't always necessarily mean that the Corps is involved. So that's just something we try to highlight to people. A lot of people assume that the Corps regulates floodplains, and that's just not necessarily the case. So just keep that in mind. Dredging activities. So this is a question we do get a lot from people, I think, in this audience is, what happens if I have an aquatic resource and I am just removing material from that resource? Do I need a permit for that? And the answer is generally no. If you're dealing with a 404 resource, the key word in what we regulate there is the discharge of dredged and or fill material. If you are just removing material and it's solely an excavation type activity, you do not need a permit from our office for that. That's a question we get. I don't know if anybody has any questions on that, but that is an important distinction between discharging fill and dredging fill. No? Okay. So like I said, the important thing with that.
One question, Andrew.
I think there's a head scratching going on with that one because the difference, the wording with the dredging or removing. So help me understand that once again. Is it the side casting that's the problem, or you're dredging, anytime you're digging there, you're dredging, are you not?
Yeah, so I mean, you're going to have some level of incidental fallback into an aquatic resource. We don't necessarily look at that. So one of the questions we get a lot is ditch maintenance. So that's say you have a linear feature that goes through your property and it's silted in and now you have some wetland material in it. Well, what if you take a track hoe or something like that and you just go onto the side of it and you scoop that material out and you dispose of it in uplands? Do I need a permit for that? Well, there's not a discharge associated with that. So if it's solely an excavation removal type activity, it doesn't need a permit from our office because there's not necessarily a discharge associated with that.
This is really more of a maintenance than anything else.
It can be. That's typically where we see it is, activity involved with maintenance types activities. But there are other unique situations where I've went to a site and, someone has impacted a water and I get out there, but they haven't discharged any fill. They removed fill material for one reason or another. And for the Corps to be involved under Section 404, there must be a discharge of fill. So maintenance is usually where we see that, but it's not always the case. There are other situations I can think of where people have decided to scoop material out of an aquatic resource for one reason or another. And it's not necessarily something the Corps has the authority to regulate. Rachel kind of touched on this a little earlier. The thing to keep in mind with that, though, is if you take your heavy machinery into the aquatic resource, you could still kind of fall under our program for that part of the activity. So say you had a large stream on your property and you decided, I want to go in there and scoop something out of it. You take some heavy machinery into the stream, you scoop the material out and you take it into uplands and you get reported to my office and you tell me like, hey, we were only dredging the material out of there. We didn't discharge anything, but we took tracked machinery and heavy machinery into the stream. We could still look at that activity as a discharge, just for the machinery going into the aquatic resource. So that's why I try to use the example of a ditch. It's very easy to visually look at. You put heavy machinery and uplands on the side of it, you just scoop the material out and you put whatever material you scooped out into uplands. There's not necessarily a discharge associated with that activity. Not something that the Corps would have the authority to regulate under Section 404. All right. Was there any more questions on that?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. All right. So this is dredging activities on Section 10. Again, we don't see this very often here, but this is entirely different than what I just said for a Section 10 water. Any work in Section 10 water will always require a permit. So if you are dredging material out of a Section 10 water, mainly your navigable waterways, you're going to need a Section 10 permit for that. Everything I said about the previous slide, that applies to 404 streams, basically non-navigable aquatic resources. So the only time that you would need a 404 permit if you're just dredging material is if you plan to dispose of that dredge material into another aquatic resource. So let's go back to my previous example of a ditch. You have a ditch, you want to pull the material out of it. You say, I'm going to pull that material out. And then you decide, I'm going to go put it into, wetland A over here. You wouldn't need a 404 permit to pull the material out of the ditch, but you may need a 404 permit if you decide to go put it in a wetland. So that's kind of the one caveat to that. So this kind of goes back to what I talked about a little bit earlier. Endangered species are something that the Corps has to consider with all of our reviews. This is the field office in the state of Ohio that coordinates any fish and or endangered species or threatened species actions in the state of Ohio. Their website is on there. Again, if you have a permit, if you're going to need a permit from the Corps, I highly recommend just going on and filling out their form and asking them to do a preliminary review of your project. It will save you an abundant amount of time. And it's very easy to do. And the Fish and Wildlife Service in the state of Ohio is a very responsive federal agency. Typically, a couple days are all it takes for them to get back to you with some sort of guidance. Tree clearing is the one thing that always comes up with projects that the Corps reviews when it comes to threatened and endangered species. As I said, almost every tree in the state of Ohio can be viewed as potential habitat for a threatened or endangered bat species in the state of Ohio. So if you're going to be removing trees as part of your project, you're almost going to need to notify the Corps and let us go through the consultation process with the Fish and Wildlife Service. That tends to worry people. They tend to think, coordinating with the Fish and Wildlife Service can be a difficult process. It's really not the state of Ohio. Some states are more difficult, and I've worked in many states. Ohio is probably the easiest one that I've seen. Typically, if you're going to remove trees in the state of Ohio, what the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to require is a seasonal tree clearing restriction. Basically, they're just going to ask that you remove those trees in the winter months when they're typically not foraging or nesting habitat for threatened or endangered bats. If you have a large amount of tree removal and they don't really have a line in the sand that they draw to say this is when they're going to require this, but if you have a large amount of tree removal, they could require some presence absence surveys for bat species prior to finalizing their coordination. I let people know that, but it doesn't happen very often, but it can. So. Migratory birds are something that the Corps takes into consideration when we coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But if I'm being just transparent, it's not something that we typically would be something that would delay a permit review. We mention this in every action that we submit to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's pretty rare that they come back with something for this specific stipulation. One of the areas that it does come back is potentially up by Grand Lake St. Mary's. There are a number of migratory bird breeding habitat areas around Grand Lake St. Mary's. So I do see that occasionally there, but it's not something that's usually of concern to your average permit seeker to our office. So we had a question about freshwater mussels earlier. If you're in a perennial stream, this is something that does come up in the state of Ohio. Every freshwater mussel is protected in some way in the state of Ohio, whether at the state level or the federal level. So there's a river survey protocol for the state of Ohio. I'm not the expert on that, but some actions do require survey work. The Corps primarily only looks at federally threatened and endangered species, which are a little bit more limited than your more common mussel species. But if you are in a perennial stream, it is something to be aware of very early on that you may have mussel requirements as part of your review. This is another aspect of something that the Corps considers the National Wild and Scenic Rivers. Primarily in my region, the one that I deal with is the Little Miami River, but there are others in the state of Ohio. This comes into play anytime you're going to be doing something within the river channel of a National Wild and Scenic River. Basically, what happens with those actions is we coordinate that with the National Park Service. They try to make sure that your activity doesn't adversely affect the aesthetics of the river to impact its status as threatened or as a wild and scenic river. Basically, sometimes they just ask for actions to be done in a manner to reduce the impact. So, if you had a bank stabilization proposal on, say, the Great Miami River, we might just ask that you use, clean fill, hard stone, that type of thing. If you were going to do it on the Little Miami River, the National Park Service might ask that you do the same activity, but maybe do it in a way that makes it look a little more natural. Maybe, put some plantings over the rock. I've seen them ask for that just to try to keep it a little bit more natural and scenic looking. Typically, it's not a time-consuming process on your end, but they may put some additional asks on how you design the project just to help the water body maintain its aesthetic look. Historic properties. This is one where we get a lot of questions, and for most of our actions, this is the one that can add time to the Corps' review process. So, as I said earlier, the Corps has to consider any known or unknown historic or cultural resources that could be impacted as part of your project. So when you submit an action to the Corps, um, this is the SHPO's contact information. You can go on their website and you can
Andrew, we can't hear you. You. Bird's coming. Lost him.
Lost them.
Come on, Brooke.
Yes, and they say don't require.
Back. There you go.
Oh,
Sorry, go.
it's kind of,
Sorry, go ahead.
Hold on, Andrew.
Fairness. That.
Sorry, was there a question?
No, we were just having some issues with your audio coming through a minute there, so I just wanted to come up here
Oh,
and
okay.
see. Go ahead and keep going, I guess. I think we're hearing you okay at the moment.
Okay, so like I was saying, the historic properties is the one that tends to cause the most questions and usually sometimes some delay with the Corps' review. So that's why I said earlier, I highly recommend using their application consultation process. You can go on their website, and I don't know if you heard this earlier, put a polygon over your project, brief project description, and they'll let you know whether or not they have any concerns. If they come back at that point and they say they have no concerns, you don't need to coordinate any further with our office. Like I said, I can usually get through the process pretty easily with just that level of information. If you don't want to do that, you have to submit at a minimum what we call a preliminary resource review with your application to the Corps. What that does is that has to be done by a qualified individual. And what they will do is they will look at the surrounding area and they will try to determine whether or not there are any known cultural resources. And they should put in there whether or not there's the potential for unknown cultural resources. I will coordinate that information with the SHPO office. And if they come back and say they have no concerns at that point, the Corps can move forward with your review. They can come back and request additional information. If they come back and request a phase 1 archaeological study, that's somewhat common in the state of Ohio. You would have to go out and complete that survey work, and then we'd have to re-coordinate that with the SHPO. If nothing's found at that point, it's usually done at that point. If they do find a potential cultural or historic resource that is potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and your project is going to adversely impact that resource, then we have to go through a whole nother process to mitigate for that adverse effect. And that can be a somewhat time-consuming process. We have to put that out on public notice. We have to get interested parties, and we have to develop a memorandum of agreement to mitigate for that adverse effect. The other thing that has come in to the Corps' review process is if you have an archaeological study and it discovers a prehistoric resource, or if there is a known prehistoric resource in the immediate vicinity of your project, we also have to coordinate our action with the known tribes who have been known to use this area. Currently, I think there are 45 of them, and we have to send a letter to each one to see if they have any comments or concerns about your project. So historic properties is just one, it's the one. When people call me early and they want to know what the review time is for their the Corps' review for their project, every other thing I can usually tell you how long it's going to take. Historic properties is the one outlier for that. Unless the Corps has a very limited permit review area, going back to my example of just a utility line or a water line crossing a very small resource, it's very difficult for me to say how long my review process is going to take because these are the ones that are hard to account for. I don't know if there's any questions on that. Feel free to let me know, but this is one that I sometimes get questions on. Reports of unauthorized activities. We get these quite a bit in the Corps. So, say you're driving down the street and you see someone doing something in a a stream and you don't think they have a permit, or, you know, your neighbor's doing something and, you know, that you don't think they have a permit, you can report that to the Corps. We get these pretty regularly. Uh, Most of the time, there's a resolution that's pretty easy for us to get through. But the one thing to keep in mind is when it comes to enforcement actions, the Corps has discretionary authority on what activities we decide to pursue for enforcement action, and which one, and how in depth we want to go with that investigation. So, you know, we get a lot of these, and we have to prioritize the ones that tend to have the biggest impact. So if you report something to us, just be aware that if it's not followed up on quickly or to what you're expecting, we get that complaint a lot. One of the things to remember with unauthorized activities is that our primary goal for an unauthorized activity is to try to get that activity into compliance with a permit. So a lot of times we get complaints to our office from a neighbor who wants to tell me that, you know, their neighbor did X, Y, and Z. They don't like it. It's something they're upset about. Most of the time when we deal with that violating neighbor, we just try to get their activity to be in compliance with a permit. And if it is, that's kind of as far as we take that action. So just something to keep in mind. If you report an activity to our office, or if you're reported to an activity for an activity, our primary goal is generally to try to get that activity in compliance and to be into compliance with one of our permits. You know, so this is kind of the general questions that we've first asked ourselves if we get a complaint of an unauthorized activity. First thing we look at is whether or not it's within our jurisdiction. Going back to what I was talking about with floodplains, we get a lot of complaints about people discharging fill in a floodplain. That's not necessarily within our jurisdiction. So when we get those, we don't typically follow up on them because they're immediately closed out as being outside of our jurisdiction. Next thing we look at is whether or not it falls under one of our regulatory authorities. You know, Section 404 is primarily the one we deal with. So say we get a report of an activity, we determine that it's within our jurisdiction, it's in a stream or wetland that we have jurisdiction over. Next thing we look at, is there a discharge of fill material? So if you're just dredging material and we decide there's no discharge of fill material at that point, there's no further action from our office if we determine that there's no discharge of fill. So we get a unauthorized activity report. We determine it's within our jurisdiction, and we determine it's within our authority to regulate. There is a discharge of fill. The next thing we look at is, does it qualify for a permit? So some permits, like I kind of touched on this earlier, have notification criteria. So, you know, say you have somebody put some fill material on the side of a stream to stabilize 20 linear feet of a bank. They didn't get a permit ahead of time from our office. They got reported by our neighbor. We go out and look at it and we say, okay, it's within a stream. There is a discharge of fill material. The next thing I'm going to look at is it covered by an authorization? Nationwide Permit 13 for bank stabilization has a lot of ability to be used in some instances without notifying the Corps. So I might go out there and say, yes, it's within my jurisdiction. Yes, there's a discharge of fill, but it probably qualifies under an existing authorization. That's about as far. I'm not going to follow up on it much more after that. I might give the homeowner or the person that did that activity some informational guidance so they don't get themselves in trouble in the future. But if it's covered by an existing authorization that wouldn't require notification from the Corps, we're not going to follow up on it much more past that. Are there any questions on that? No? Okay. So when you want to submit something to the Corps, how do you do it? This is the primary way to submit something to the Corps right now. We used to be a paper-only submittal agency, but we changed that a little while ago. So if you need to submit something to the Corps, the email address at the top of this slide is how you submit that to the Corps. When you submit that, whether it be a jurisdictional determination, an unauthorized activity report, a PCN for an application, it goes to one of our regulatory chiefs, and they'll assign it to a project manager for them to start their review of it. If you have a very large submittal, you can email that and say, you know, I have a 25 megabyte submittal. It won't let me email it. And we have a file exchange service that we use, and we can send you a link so you can still get that to us. So that's the easiest way to do it. We are also starting to implement something called the regulatory request system. This is something that other districts are a little bit more further along in, but you can actually go into the regulatory request system, submit your request, whatever it is, and it will actually auto upload it into our tracking system, which is called ORM. It will assign it a file number, and it will allow you to upload your documents there. And it will, once assigned to a project manager, will email you that it's been assigned to a specific project manager, and it should have their contact information on it. So we're kind of in the implementation stage of getting that rolled out in this district, but it is available if you'd like to use it. So this just kind of goes over some of the lessons learned. I'm not going to go over all of these because this is just kind of a summary of some of the stuff I talked about. Like I said, the things the JD stuff is pretty important. The Fish and Wildlife Service, I don't want to say it's not important, but it's not usually what causes delays in our review for permit actions. Section 106 is really the one that I try to stomp my foot on the hardest. Just if you're going to have something coming to our office for a permit review in the state of Ohio, especially for an area-based project, just try to be aware of that, because it can cause delays or additional work that you weren't really anticipating. Yeah. So a lot of lessons learned.
Yeah, and Andrew, we're running short on our time. We're over our time, actually.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah. So I'll just, sorry about that. I'll just open it up to, if there's any questions on anything that I went over. I don't want to keep any people here longer than they need to be, but if anybody has any questions, you can ask them now. This is Teresa's contact information. You can reach out to her, or you can reach out to any of the project managers in the state of Ohio. We can all answer questions. Teresa is a very busy person, so even if you email her, she might delegate it down to one of the project managers to answer your questions. I can provide my direct contact information to the hosts of this, and they can disseminate that freely. And you can always call me or email me any questions you have. I always try to tell people it's much easier to answer your questions on the front end and kind of stop a problem early than if you get further along in your project and we have to fix something in the middle. So that's just kind of my little pitch. I'll always feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm here to answer your questions. That's my job.
I appreciate it. Be sure we have a copy of your presentation too. So we're gonna push these resources out to everyone. With that, I just want to thank our guest today. Thank you for participating. And we will say so long till next time.